At my 33rd birthday dinner, my parents did not give me a card or a gift. Instead, my mother slid a formal legal eviction notice across the white linen tablecloth of a five-star steakhouse and told me I had exactly until midnight to vacate my apartment. I did not cry or beg. I just smiled, paid my portion of the bill, and walked out. 3 days later, their premium credit cards declined at the checkout line of Whole Foods, and they suddenly realized they had just evicted the only person funding their fake wealthy lifestyle. My name is Lauren. I am 33 years old, and I spent 7 years acting as a human bank for my toxic family until they threw me away like trash. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to financially cut off toxic family members to protect your peace. Growing up in a middle-class suburb of Seattle, Washington, my parents Thomas and Barbara were absolutely obsessed with the illusion of high society. They leased luxury cars they could barely afford, bought designer clothes on high-interest credit cards, and poured all their genuine affection into my younger sister Amanda. Amanda was their golden child, the one who mirrored my mother perfectly. I was the scapegoat, the quiet one who focused on academics and financial independence. Even back then, I knew that money was the only language my parents truly respected, but they never respected me no matter how much of it I made. The ultimate betrayal happened on a rainy Friday evening in downtown Seattle at one of the most exclusive steakhouses in the city. I had booked a private dining room for my birthday, assuming we would have a normal family celebration. I was wearing a tailored navy suit, having just come from my office where I worked as an independent financial consultant. At least that is what my family thought I did. They had no idea about the actual extent of my career, and I preferred to keep it that way. Sitting across from me were my parents, both dressed in flashy brands, sipping expensive champagne that I was paying for. Next to them sat Amanda and her husband Terrence. Terrence is an African-American tech entrepreneur, or so he claims. In reality, he is a smooth-talking opportunist who constantly chases venture capital funding for startup ideas that never actually materialize. Amanda sat there dripping in jewelry, rubbing her slightly pregnant belly, while Terrence bragged loudly about his latest supposed business meeting. I sat quietly cutting into my medium-rare filet mignon, listening to Terrence inflate his own ego. He was talking about how his new app was going to revolutionize the market and how he was just days away from securing a massive funding round from a major Seattle investment firm. My father Thomas nodded along enthusiastically, treating Terrence like the son he always wanted. My mother Barbara chimed in to agree, completely ignoring the fact that it was my birthday dinner. Then the waiter approached our table, carrying a beautiful chocolate truffle cake with a single candle on top. He was about to set it down in front of me when my mother suddenly held up her hand. She told the waiter to hold off on the cake, dismissing him with a cold wave. The room fell quiet. The soft jazz music playing in the background suddenly felt very loud. My mother reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a crisp white envelope. She did not say happy birthday. She did not smile. She simply tossed the envelope across the table. It landed right next to my dinner plate. "Open it," she demanded, her voice completely devoid of any maternal warmth. I picked up the envelope and broke the seal. Inside was a formal, legally binding eviction notice. It stated that I had to vacate my residence immediately, giving me until exactly midnight to remove my presence from the premises. I read the document twice, feeling a strange sense of detachment wash over me. I looked up from the paper, making direct eye contact with my mother. "You are evicting me on my birthday," I stated, keeping my voice perfectly level. My father leaned forward, clasping his hands together on the table. He looked at me with an expression of mild annoyance. "Amanda and Terrence are expecting a baby," he explained coldly. "They need a larger place to live and raise their child. You are single, Lauren. You do not need a 3-bedroom apartment all to yourself. It makes logical sense for them to move in." Amanda chimed in, adopting a fake tone of sympathy. "Do not be upset, Lauren. You can easily rent a nice little studio apartment somewhere further out in the suburbs. You really should be happy to help your growing family." We need the space much more than you do. Terrence smirked, swirling the wine in his glass. He leaned back in his chair, looking incredibly arrogant. Your parents are being very generous to us, Lauren. You should learn to be a team player. After all, family takes care of family. I looked at the four of them, a group of people who felt completely entitled to everything I had. The sheer audacity of their demand was breathtaking. The apartment was technically under my parents' names on the deed. Years ago, when they were struggling with debt, I put the property in their names so they could claim a senior citizen tax exemption. It was a massive favor I did to protect them. However, I was the one who had paid the down payment. I was the one who paid the exorbitant mortgage every single month. I was the one who had just spent over $100,000 completely gutting and renovating the space with smart appliances, imported hardwood floors, and custom bathroom fixtures. It was my home funded entirely by my hard work. You want me to pack up my entire life and leave my home by midnight tonight? I asked, my voice dangerously calm. My mother crossed her arms. The lease is in our name, Lauren. The deed is in our name. Legally, it is our property. We want the keys left on the kitchen counter by midnight. Do not make this difficult. If you try to stay, your father will call the police and have you removed for trespassing. They sat there staring at me, waiting for me to break down. They wanted to see me humiliated and desperate. They wanted to exert their ultimate control over my life. But I did not cry. A profound sense of clarity settled over my mind. For 7 years I had tolerated their disrespect because I felt a lingering sense of duty. I had paid their bills and kept a roof over their heads. I had been their silent benefactor, and this eviction notice was my final reward. I neatly folded the eviction notice and placed it inside my purse. I stood up from the table, smoothing the wrinkles from my suit jacket. I signaled the waiter over and handed him my personal black credit card, instructing him to split the bill and only charge me for my specific meal and my drink. "What are you doing?" my father demanded, his face flushing with sudden anger. "You are supposed to pay for the table. You always pay for dinner." "Not anymore," I replied smoothly. "Since I have to go pack my entire apartment before midnight, I really do not have time for dessert. Enjoy your evening." I turned my back on my stunned family and walked out of the restaurant. As I stepped out into the cool Seattle night air, I pulled out my phone and dialed the number of a premium rapid response moving company. I had exactly 4 hours until midnight, and I was going to make sure my family got exactly what they asked for an empty apartment. I stood on the damp Seattle pavement, the cold drizzle matching my chilling resolve. I pressed the phone to my ear, listening to the dial tone. "Apex Rapid Relocation and Logistics." A crisp voice answered. I did not hesitate. "I need a 20-man crew, including licensed electricians and plumbers, at my downtown apartment in exactly 20 minutes. I will pay triple your emergency midnight rate plus a cash bonus if the job is completed by 11:30. The dispatcher confirmed the deployment immediately. Money talked, and I had plenty to spare. I slid into my car and drove toward the apartment. The drive gave me time to process the sheer audacity of what had just happened. My father, Thomas, coldly explaining that Amanda and Terrence needed the spacious 3-bedroom apartment for their baby. Terrence smirking, arrogantly praising his in-laws for their generosity with property they did not even pay for. Amanda faking pity, suggesting I rent a tiny studio since I was single and apparently did not need space. They honestly believed they had backed me into a corner. They thought I was just a mid-level consultant who would roll over, cry, and hand them a fully furnished luxury condo. They had no idea who they were dealing with. When I arrived at the building, the Apex moving trucks were already pulling into the loading dock. I met the foreman, Dave, in the lobby and handed him a heavy binder. Inside were the blueprints of my apartment and legally binding receipts for every upgrade I had purchased over the last 5 years. I pointed to the list. "If it is on these pages, it comes out tonight," I told him. Dave raised an eyebrow. "You want the lighting fixtures and appliances too?" he asked. I nodded. "Everything. The smart fridge, the imported Italian faucets, the crystal chandeliers, the automated blinds, even the heated towel racks. I want the place stripped to the builder-grade bare bones. If I bought it, it leaves with me. The crew worked with terrifying efficiency. While they began dismantling my expensive life, I walked into the master bedroom to pack my personal safe. As I carefully folded my designer suits, I thought about Terrence. My arrogant African-American brother-in-law had spent the entire birthday dinner boasting about his tech startup. He bragged that he was just days away from securing a massive funding round from one of Seattle's top venture capital firms. What Terrence did not know was the true nature of my career. I was not just a financial consultant. I was the silent senior partner at that exact venture capital firm. Terrence had pitched his completely hollow app to my junior partners last week. He had no idea that I reviewed the final approvals. The sounds of drills echoed through the apartment. I walked back into the kitchen to supervise. The massive refrigerator was being wheeled out on a dolly. The plumbers were capping off the water lines where my custom sink used to be, replacing it with a cheap plastic basin. The electricians removed the stunning crystal chandelier from the dining room, leaving only a basic light bulb dangling from a wire. The automated smart blinds were stripped from the floor-to-ceiling windows. They even unscrewed the luxury bidet toilet seats. I watched my beautiful, meticulously designed home transform into an empty, echoing shell. It looked worse than a foreclosure. It looked like an abandoned warehouse. By 11:45, the apartment was completely unrecognizable. The moving crew had packed everything into their trucks destined for a secure storage facility I owned across town. I tipped Dave and his crew the promised cash bonus, and they departed silently into the night. I stood alone in the center of the living room, listening to the hollow echo of my own breathing. I pulled the generic brass keys from my pocket, the ones my parents had given me 7 years ago. I walked over to the cheap laminate kitchen counter that now sat where my beautiful quartz island used to be, and I set the keys down. It was exactly 11:59. I walked out the front door and let it lock behind me. I drove to a luxury hotel downtown where I had booked a penthouse suite for the month. Once I was settled in the plush living area, I opened my laptop. It was time for the second phase of my exit strategy. For 7 years, I had quietly funded my parents' upper-middle-class illusion. Because I felt a misplaced sense of filial duty, I had set up an automatic monthly transfer of $5,000 to their primary checking account to cover their living expenses. I had also provided my mother Barbara with a platinum supplementary credit card linked to my personal wealth management account. I logged into my secure banking portal. The screen illuminated my face in the dark room. I navigated to the recurring transfers page. There it was, the $5,000 lifeline that kept their mansion out of foreclosure and funded Amanda's shopping sprees. I clicked cancel. A confirmation box popped up. I clicked confirm. Next, I went to the card management tab. I selected Barbara's supplementary platinum card. I clicked revoke and freeze. I watched the status change from active to terminated. This was not just about the money. This was about severing the invisible chains they used to control me. For years they demanded respect while offering none in return. They took my generosity as a weakness, assuming I would always be there to bail them out of their terrible decisions. I closed the laptop, took a deep breath, and poured myself a glass of sparkling water. The financial cord was officially cut. They wanted me out of their lives by midnight, and I had complied perfectly. Now all I had to do was wait for the inevitable explosion, when reality finally caught up with their delusions. The morning sun pierced through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse suite, casting a sharp golden light across the crisp white sheets. I sat up the silence of the hotel room, a stark contrast to the emotional chaos my family thrived on. I ordered a black coffee from room service and sat at the glass dining table watching the Seattle skyline wake up. My phone vibrated against the glass. The caller ID displayed my father's name. I let it ring 3 times before sliding my finger across the screen to answer. I knew exactly why he was calling. He needed to assert his dominance in the cold light of day. "Good morning," Lauren Thomas said, his tone dripping with the manufactured professionalism he reserved for business subordinates. I am calling to confirm that you followed instructions and vacated the premises by midnight. I took a slow sip of my coffee. I left the keys on the kitchen counter exactly as Barbara requested. I was out before the clock struck 12. A heavy sigh echoed through the receiver. Good. I want you to know that your mother and I are willing to overlook your little temper tantrum at the restaurant last night. We understand that transitioning can be difficult for someone in your position, but you need to realize this is for the greater good of the family. Amanda and Terrence are building a legacy. You are just coasting. I kept my voice perfectly neutral. Coasting. Is that what you call paying the mortgage on a luxury downtown apartment for 5 years? Thomas chuckled, a condescending sound that used to make my stomach tie itself in knots. Do not rewrite history, Lauren. You were paying rent. We graciously allowed you to live in our investment property, and you paid us a monthly fee for the privilege. You should be thanking us for keeping a roof over your head. I set my coffee cup down. The ceramic clicked sharply against the glass table. Let us be entirely accurate about this investment property, Thomas. 5 years ago, you and Barbara were drowning in credit card debt. You begged me to purchase that apartment. You pleaded with me to put the deed in your name so you could claim a senior citizen property tax exemption to hide your assets from creditors. I paid the $200,000 down payment out of my own pocket. I wired the monthly mortgage payment directly to the bank. You never spent a single dime on that property. You are confused, he replied smoothly, slipping into the practiced gaslighting he had honed over decades. You gave us a cash gift to help us secure the loan because your credit was insufficient at the time. We took on the immense legal liability of a mortgage to help you get on your feet. You lived there as our tenant. The fact that you equate paying basic rent with ownership just shows how financially illiterate you truly are. I listened to his delusion, marveling at how completely he believed his own lies. He had repeated this false narrative so many times in his head that it had become his absolute reality. And what about the upgrades? I asked, leaning back in my chair. I spent over $100,000 renovating that space. I hired the contractors. I paid for the custom marble countertops, the imported hardwood floors, the smart home security system, and the crystal lighting fixtures. Did your imaginary tenant agreement cover luxury capital improvements to your property? Those were unauthorized modifications to a property you did not own. Thomas fired back, his voice tightening with irritation. Your mother and I were actually quite upset that you altered our property without consulting us first. However, we decided to be magnanimous and accept those fixtures as a gift to the family. When you make improvements to a home you do not own, those improvements belong to the landlord. That is basic real estate law, Lauren. You cannot simply claim ownership of a house just because you bought a few nice lights and a new sink. Whoever holds the deed owns the home, and the deed has our names printed right at the top. I smiled to myself, looking out over the city. His absolute reliance on that piece of paper was his fatal flaw. He was so blinded by his own greed and his desire to hand Amanda a perfect life on a silver platter that he never bothered to check the legal definition of tenant improvements versus personal property. You are absolutely right, I said, infusing my voice with a tone of quiet surrender. Whoever holds the deed owns the walls and the floorboards. I was foolish to think my financial contributions meant anything to this family. You and Barbara are the legal owners of that apartment. I hope Amanda and Terrence enjoy the space exactly as you own it. Thomas relaxed his tone, returning to that of a benevolent patriarch. I am glad you are finally seeing reason. It takes maturity to admit when you are wrong. Your mother will be pleased to hear you have dropped this ridiculous attitude. Perhaps in a few months, when the baby is born, we can invite you over for dinner. You can see how beautifully Amanda decorates the nursery. Just remember to use the guest entrance. I will keep that in mind, I replied. Enjoy your new investment property, Thomas. I ended the call and tossed my phone onto the table. The unspoken truth of our family dynamic had never been clearer. They did not just want my money. They wanted to erase my existence and claim my achievements as their own. They wanted Amanda to live in a luxury home that I paid for while forcing me to smile and thank them for the privilege of being exploited. They had spent years slowly stripping away my boundaries, convincing themselves that my wealth was their birthright. But the gaslighting only worked when I cared about their approval. Now that I had severed the emotional cord, their manipulations sounded like the desperate rambling of con artists. I stood up and walked toward the bathroom to get dressed for the day. The trap was fully set. Thomas was utterly convinced that he had won the argument and secured a lavish, fully furnished home for his golden child. He had no idea that the apartment he was bragging about was currently a gutted, empty shell. He had no idea that the credit card in his wallet was completely useless. The countdown had begun, and the fallout was going to be spectacular. As I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse watching the morning traffic navigate the Seattle streets, my thoughts drifted back to the exact moment I had walked away from their table 12 hours earlier. The memory of my silent exit played in my mind like a meticulously directed film, a perfect sequence of events that had permanently altered the trajectory of all our lives. At the restaurant, after I handed the waiter my black card to pay for only my portion of the meal, the silence at the table had been deafening. But the second I turned my back and began to walk away, I heard it, the distinct, arrogant sound of my father chuckling. It was a low, rumbling laugh that signaled his perceived victory. My mother immediately joined in, her high-pitched giggle piercing through the ambient noise of the elegant dining room. I could hear Terence and Amanda clinking their crystal champagne flutes together in a celebratory toast. They were practically cheering. They honestly thought I was retreating in absolute defeat. They believed that my silence was the ultimate submission, that I was rushing off in a panic to pack my belongings and hand them the keys out of pure broken obedience. I did not cry. I did not beg. For 33 years, I had been conditioned to react to their cruelty with emotional outbursts, pleading for their approval, or trying to logically explain why their relentless demands were unfair. That was the toxic dynamic they thrived on. They fed on my distress. It made them feel powerful and important. But last night, I starved them. Walking through the dimly lit dining room of the steakhouse, my posture was rigid, and my expression was completely unreadable. The smell of roasted meats and expensive wine filled the air around me. Patrons at nearby tables, who had undoubtedly overheard my mother drop the eviction notice onto my birthday cake, watched me pass. I offered them polite, tight-lipped smiles. I was not a victim fleeing a crime scene. I was a strategist executing a flawless pivot. I pushed through the heavy glass double doors and stepped out into the crisp, damp evening air. The valet stand was situated under a large canvas awning that offered shelter from the light Seattle drizzle. The attendant, a young man in a sharp uniform, hurried over to take my ticket. As he jogged off to retrieve my vehicle, I stood alone on the pavement. The streetlights reflected off the wet asphalt, and the distant hum of the city traffic felt incredibly grounding. My heart was not racing. My palms were not sweating. Instead, a profound, absolute silence settled over my mind. It was the unmistakable sound of an emotional cord finally snapping. I was no longer their daughter. I was a financial liability they had foolishly miscalculated. I pulled my phone from my clutch. I bypassed my personal contacts entirely and opened my professional directory. I needed a specialized team, people who asked no questions and worked with absolute discretion and blistering speed. I dialed the emergency dispatch number for Apex Rapid Relocation and Logistics. The phone rang twice before a crisp alert voice answered. I identified myself using my corporate account credentials, ensuring priority service. I need a catastrophic level deployment, I told the dispatcher, my voice cutting cleanly through the ambient noise of the street. I require a 20-man crew including licensed electricians, plumbers, and demolition specialists. They need to be at my downtown residence in exactly 20 minutes. The dispatcher paused, likely checking his late-night availability matrix. That is a massive request for a Friday night, ma'am. It will incur our maximum emergency tariff. I did not blink. I will pay triple your emergency rate plus a substantial cash bonus for every single worker on site provided the job is completed to my exact specifications by 11:30 tonight. Bring 3 commercial box trucks and prepare for total asset extraction. I want everything removed. The smart appliances, the imported bathroom fixtures, the custom chandeliers, all of it. If it can be unscrewed or unbolted, it goes into the truck. The dispatcher quickly confirmed the deployment details and assured me the fleet was already mobilizing. When the valet pulled my car up to the curb, I was just finishing my instructions regarding the secure climate-controlled storage facility where my extracted assets would be deposited. I tipped the valet a $100 bill, slid into the leather driver's seat, and firmly closed the door. The heavy soundproofing of the luxury vehicle completely muted the city outside, wrapping me in a cocoon of quiet determination. As I pulled away from the curb and merged into the traffic, I glanced in my rearview mirror. Through the large front windows of the steakhouse, I could vaguely make out the silhouette of my family still seated at their premium table. They were probably ordering dessert right at that moment. They were likely ordering the most expensive cognac on the menu, celebrating their brilliant real estate acquisition, completely assuming that my $5,000 monthly auto-pay allowance would cover the exorbitant bill just as it always did. They were feasting on the grand illusion of power. My silent exit had been my final, ultimate gift to them. By denying them a screaming match in the middle of the restaurant, I denied them the opportunity to play the innocent victims. By not begging for more time, I deprived my mother of her absolute favorite power trip. My silence was not a surrender. It was the calm before a devastating financial hurricane. And now, sitting in the morning light of this penthouse suite, I knew the physical extraction of the apartment had only been the very first phase. The apartment was now a gutted shell. The financial pipeline was officially severed. The silence I had maintained last night was about to be replaced by the deafening reality of their own impending bankruptcy. They had demanded I leave their property by midnight, and I had honored their request with malicious, spectacular compliance. They had absolutely no idea that their entire world was about to collapse. To understand the sheer scale of their impending collapse, you have to picture the scene at my apartment just hours prior. When my car had pulled into the underground parking garage of the luxury high-rise, the 3 commercial box trucks from Apex Rapid Relocation were already lined up and waiting. I parked in my assigned spot and walked toward the loading dock. 20 men in matching dark gray uniforms stood in a highly disciplined formation. The foreman, a broad-shouldered man named Dave, stepped forward to meet me. He carried a heavy-duty clipboard and looked completely unfazed by the aggressive midnight deadline. I handed Dave the thick leather binder I kept in the trunk of my car. This binder contained the original blueprints of the apartment alongside perfectly organized, legally binding receipts for every single upgrade I had purchased over the past 5 years. I opened the binder and pointed to the highlighted sections. If an item is listed on these pages, I told him it comes out of the apartment tonight. I paid for these upgrades out of my personal accounts, which makes them my personal property. We are not damaging the structural integrity of the building, but we are stripping away every piece of luxury I financed. Dave reviewed the documents with a professional eye. He checked the permits, the invoices, and the legal disclaimers. Once he was satisfied that everything was completely above board, he signaled to his crew. The precision of their movement was breathtaking. They unloaded Dolly's power tools, protective floor runners, and heavy-duty packing crates. We took the freight elevator up to the penthouse level. When I unlocked the front door and pushed it open, the crew immediately swarmed the apartment like a highly coordinated army of ants. I stood in the entryway and watched my meticulously curated life get systematically deconstructed. The kitchen was their first target. 2 plumbers shut off the main water valves and began detaching the imported Italian farmhouse sink. Next to them, electricians disconnected the massive smart refrigerator, the dual convection ovens, and the built-in wine cooler. These were not cheap builder-grade appliances. I had spent over $40,000 on the kitchen alone. The crew wheeled the massive stainless steel units out the door, leaving behind empty gaping alcoves with exposed wires and bare drywall. In the living room, the demolition was equally swift. I had installed a state-of-the-art automated blind system that covered the floor-to-ceiling windows. A team of 3 men climbed tall ladders and carefully unscrewed the motorized tracks, pulling down the heavy silk drapes and the expensive mechanisms. Without the window treatments, the bare glass reflected the harsh utility lights the moving crew had set up. The room instantly felt cold and cavernous. Next came the lighting. I directed the electricians to the dining area, where a massive crystal chandelier hung above where my dining table used to sit. It took 4 men to safely unhook the fixture, lower it to the ground, and secure it inside a custom padded crate. They did the same to the designer pendant lights in the hallway and the custom sconces in the master bedroom. They replaced every single luxury fixture with the cheapest bare minimum light bulbs required by code. The warm, inviting ambiance of the apartment vanished, replaced by the sterile, harsh glare of a basement interrogation room. The bathrooms were perhaps the most satisfying part of the extraction. I had personally supervised the installation of the smart mirrors, with built-in defoggers and LED lighting. The crew meticulously detached them from the walls. The plumbers removed the rainfall shower heads, the high-end brushed nickel faucets, and the heated luxury bidet toilet seats. They capped the pipes professionally, ensuring there were no leaks, but they left the bathrooms looking like abandoned gas station facilities. As the hours ticked by, the sheer volume of material being loaded into the freight elevator was staggering. My custom-built walk-in closet, which featured integrated shelving and velvet-lined jewelry drawers, was dismantled board by board. The built-in surround sound speakers were popped out of the ceilings, leaving perfectly round empty holes behind. Even the smart thermostat on the hallway wall was unscrewed and replaced with a generic, outdated plastic dial I had sent an assistant to purchase from a 24-hour hardware store. I walked from room to room holding my tablet, checking off items on my digital inventory list. I felt absolutely no attachment to the physical objects. I was not mourning the loss of my home. I was reclaiming my assets. Every screw removed, every wire disconnected, every appliance wheeled out the door was a tangible reclaiming of my power. My parents had demanded that I vacate the premises. They had arrogantly assumed I would leave them a turnkey luxury palace for their golden child to inherit. They fundamentally misunderstood the difference between owning the drywall and owning the lifestyle within it. By 11:15, the apartment was unrecognizable. The sleek modern oasis I had built had been reduced to a depressing hollow shell. The floors were swept clean of debris, leaving only the original scuffed laminate that had been hiding beneath my expensive area rugs. The walls were dotted with minor holes where heavy art and fixtures had been mounted. The air smelled of dust and industrial packing tape. Dave approached me, wiping sweat from his forehead. He handed me the final sign-off sheet. "Everything listed in your binder has been successfully extracted and loaded onto the trucks," he reported. "We are ready to transport the cargo to your secure storage facility." I reviewed the paperwork, signed my name at the bottom, and handed him a thick envelope containing the promised cash bonuses for the entire crew. They had executed a flawless surgical extraction in record time. I smiled in complete satisfaction. The physical uninstallation of my past life was finished. Now they owned nothing. I watched Dave hand off the last clipboard to his crew chief, but my eyes wandered back to the kitchen. Or rather, the empty rectangular void that used to be a kitchen. While the major appliances were already loaded into the freight elevator, a specialized secondary team was now ripping out the custom soft-close cabinetry I had imported from Germany. The sound of pry bars separating the expensive wood from the drywall echoed harshly through the cavernous space. I had paid top dollar for those cabinets, and I was not about to let Amanda store her organic baby food in them. Beneath the cabinets, the walls were scarred with adhesive lines and exposed drywall paper, a jarring contrast to the perfection that had existed just hours ago. I walked down the hallway, my heels clicking loudly against the cheap, scuffed subflooring that remained after they peeled up my premium acoustic underlayment. I paused at the central utility closet. The The smart heating and cooling system I had custom ordered was currently being dismantled by a certified heating and air technician. I had spent $15,000 on a zoned climate control hub that allowed individual temperature settings for every room controlled entirely via smartphone. The technician methodically disconnected the sleek glass control panels from the walls, capping the low-voltage wires with bright orange wire nuts. In their place, he installed the most basic, outdated beige plastic thermostats available on the market. The apartment was already growing uncomfortably chilly as the ambient heat escaped through the uninsulated vents. Thomas and Barbara wanted a free house so they could freeze in it. My inspection continued into the master suite, where my imported bathroom fixtures had just been fully extracted. The plumbers had finished capping the lines where my freestanding soaking tub used to sit. They had removed the heated marble floor tiles I had meticulously selected, leaving behind a rough, uneven concrete subfloor that looked like it belonged in a prison cell. The floating double vanity with its integrated LED lighting was gone, replaced by empty plumbing stubs protruding awkwardly from the bare drywall. Even the custom glass shower enclosure had been dismantled and crated up. To ensure the space was legally habitable, I had instructed the crew to install a single flimsy fiberglass utility sink and a basic showerhead that looked like it belonged in a cheap motel. The luxury spa oasis I had built to escape the stress of my toxic family was completely erased. I moved back into the main living area. The demolition specialists were finishing their final sweep. I had authorized them to remove the high-end baseboards and crown molding I had installed to frame the rooms. The sound of hammers tearing the thick, elegant wood away from the walls was like music to my ears. Without the molding, the transition between the walls and the cheap floors looked jagged, unfinished, and incredibly cheap. The apartment had been reduced to a barren, depressing concrete and drywall box. It looked exactly like the hollow, superficial lives my parents and my sister led. The crew finished loading the last of the custom interior doors I had purchased to replace the hollow core builder-grade ones. I watched as they carried out the solid oak panels, leaving the door frames empty and exposed. The foreman approached me one last time, wiping his hands on a rag. "The trucks are loaded and secured," he confirmed, his voice echoing in the empty space. "We are heading to the climate-controlled storage unit now. Everything is tagged and inventoried." I thanked him profusely, verifying the transfer details on my tablet before locking the screen. Suddenly, the apartment was completely silent. The kind of silence that rings in your ears. The only light came from the harsh, flickering street lamps outside, bleeding through the bare, uncovered windows. I took a slow, deliberate walk through every room. I let my fingertips brush against the rough, torn drywall where my beautiful art collection used to hang. I looked at the exposed wire bundles dangling from the ceiling where the custom crystal chandeliers had illuminated my dinner parties. I stared at the cheap stained laminate flooring that now stretched endlessly across the living room. They thought they had backed me into a corner. They thought their eviction notice was a masterstroke of manipulation. They believed they were going to walk into a multi-million-dollar turnkey luxury condo, pour themselves a glass of my expensive wine and toast to their own brilliance. Instead, they were going to walk into a nightmare of their own making. I reached into my designer purse and pulled out the set of generic brass keys. These were the keys my father had smugly handed me years ago, acting as if he were bestowing a grand blessing upon me, completely ignoring the fact that my money had secured the property. I walked over to the kitchen area. There was no island left. There were no countertops. There was only a small, cheap folding table the contractors had used to hold their tools, which I had instructed them to leave behind. I pulled out my phone and checked the time. The glowing digits read 11:58. I had 1 minute left to comply with their legal demand. I placed the brass keys squarely in the center of the folding table. The metal clinked sharply in the quiet room. I took a step back, admiring the absolute desolation I had orchestrated. This was not just a move out. This was a surgical strike against their entitlement. I turned on my heel and walked toward the front door. The cheap builder-grade door clicked shut behind me, the locking mechanism echoing down the empty hallway. I checked my phone one last time. It was exactly 11:59. I smiled, took a deep, incredibly satisfying breath, and walked away forever, leaving my toxic family to deal with the absolute ruin they had brought upon themselves. The next morning, the Seattle sky was a brilliant, unyielding blue. I sat at my massive mahogany desk on the 42nd floor of the downtown high-rise that housed my venture capital firm. The panoramic view of the Puget Sound stretched out before me, a vast expanse of deep water dotted with ferries and cargo ships. This was my real world. Down on the streets below, people rushed to their corporate jobs entirely unaware of the multi-million-dollar acquisitions happening behind these soundproof glass walls. My family was equally clueless. They genuinely believed I was just a mid-level financial consultant, scraping by on a modest salary, quietly desperate for their approval. They had no idea that the woman they had evicted at midnight was currently reviewing a term sheet for a $50 million tech buyout before her first cup of coffee. I set my espresso down on the polished wood and opened my personal encrypted laptop. The physical extraction of my apartment was complete, but the most crucial phase of my exit strategy was digital. For 7 years, I had been the invisible pillar holding up the fragile, crumbling structure of my parents' upper-middle-class facade. It started small. A grocery bill here, a utility payment there, under the guise that they were struggling seniors transitioning into retirement. But toxic entitlement is a bottomless pit. That small assistance quickly morphed into a permanent, non-negotiable expectation. I logged into my private wealth management portal and navigated to the automated transfers dashboard. There it was, the monthly lifeline. Every single month on the 28th day, a direct wire transfer of $5,000 moved from my account into Thomas and Barbara's primary checking account. They called it their living stipend. In reality, it was the blood money that funded their leased Mercedes, their country club membership, and the lavish gifts they constantly showered upon Amanda. Over 7 years, I had quietly funneled $420,000 in cash directly into their pockets. And their gratitude for this massive financial sacrifice was to hand me an eviction notice on my birthday. I hovered my cursor over the active transfer protocol. A deep, settling calm washed over me. I was not doing this out of spite. I was executing a long, overdue correction of a catastrophic bad investment. I clicked the edit button. A drop-down menu appeared. I selected Cancel Recurring Transfer. A prompt asked if I was sure I wanted to terminate this financial directive. I clicked Confirm. The screen refreshed and the $5,000 pipeline vanished into the digital ether. Just like that, their mortgage payment was gone, their luxury car lease payment was gone, their country club dues were gone. But I was not finished. The cash was only half the equation. I switched tabs and opened my credit card management system. Years ago, my mother had tearfully claimed she needed a card for medical emergencies. I had issued her a supplementary platinum card linked directly to my primary account. Naturally, her definition of a medical emergency rapidly expanded. I pulled up the recent transaction history for Barbara's card. The itemized list was a masterclass in hypocrisy. 2 days ago, while she was actively planning to throw me out on the street, she had charged $400 at an upscale day spa. There was a $600 charge at a luxury maternity boutique, clearly funding Amanda's new wardrobe. There were multiple charges for expensive lunches at downtown bistros, where Terrence liked to pretend he was a successful tech founder. They were feasting on my dime, while actively plotting my ruin. I clicked on the Authorized Users tab. Barbara's name sat there tied to a piece of plastic that gave her unlimited access to my hard-earned wealth. I selected her profile. The options loaded on the screen. Suspend report stolen or revoke permanently. I did not hesitate. I clicked Revoke Permanently. The system processed the request for a fraction of a second before flashing a green confirmation banner. The card was officially dead. It was now nothing more than a useless piece of plastic sitting in her designer wallet. To ensure the severing was absolute, I contacted my private banker directly. I instructed him to place a hard lock on all my personal accounts. I flagged Thomas, Barbara, Amanda, and Terrence by name. I informed the bank that under no circumstances were these individuals authorized to access information request funds or speak on my behalf. I knew exactly how my mother operated. When the card declined, her first instinct would be to call customer service, play the victim, and try to social engineer her way past the security protocols by claiming it was a banking error. Now, any attempt she made would be met with a frozen account and an unyielding fraud department. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair and exhaled. The physical cord was cut at midnight. The financial cord was severed at 9 in the morning. I felt incredibly light. For the first time in my adult life, my money belonged solely to me. I was no longer funding my own emotional abuse. I looked at the calendar on my desk. Today was the 26th. The $5,000 auto pay was scheduled to hit in exactly 2 days. My parents were entirely reliant on that injection of cash to cover the mortgage on their suburban mansion. Furthermore, my mother went grocery shopping at Whole Foods every Tuesday morning like clockwork. They had no idea. They were waking up right now, probably drinking coffee in their sunroom, gloating over how easily they had dominated me at the steakhouse. They thought they had won a free luxury apartment. They had no clue that the apartment was a gutted shell, and they had absolutely no idea that their financial life support had just been flatlined. The trap was perfectly set. I turned my attention back to the $50 million venture capital term sheet on my desk. I had real business to attend to. My toxic family was about to learn the hardest economic lesson of their lives, and I was going to enjoy every single second of the impending silence before the storm. 3 days later, the storm finally made landfall. The first 48 hours after my midnight move out had been completely silent. I knew exactly why. My parents operated on a foundation of profound financial ignorance. They never checked their bank balances because they never had to. As long as the plastic cards in their wallets successfully swiped at the cash register, they assumed the money was flowing endlessly from my accounts into theirs. The 28th of the month had passed quietly on Monday. The automated $5,000 transfer they relied on to pay their suburban mansion mortgage had failed to execute. They had not noticed the missed deposit yet. They were too busy celebrating their perceived victory over me to bother logging into their online banking. But Tuesday morning was different. Tuesday was my mother's sacred routine. Every Tuesday at 10 in the morning, Barbara drove her leased Mercedes SUV to the flagship Whole Foods market in their affluent neighborhood. It was as much a social event for her as it was a grocery run. She loved parading down the aisles, filling her cart with overpriced organic produce, artisanal cheeses, and imported specialty items, making sure the other wealthy housewives saw exactly how well she lived. She relied on my platinum card to fund this weekly performance. At 10:15, I was sitting in a soundproof glass conference room at my venture capital firm. I was in the middle of reviewing a highly confidential due diligence report for a robotics acquisition when my personal cell phone began to vibrate violently against the mahogany table. The screen lit up with my mother's name. It stopped vibrating only to immediately start buzzing again. She was calling back to back, a sign of absolute unfiltered panic. I held up a finger to my junior analysts, signaling for a brief pause in our meeting. I picked up the phone, stepped out of the conference room, and walked down the quiet carpeted hallway toward my private office. I tapped the green accept button and brought the phone to my ear. I did not even get a chance to say hello. "Lauren, call your bank right this second," Barbara shrieked. Her voice was an octave higher than normal, completely stripped of its usual haughty elegance. She sounded frantic, breathless, and incredibly angry. I closed my office door and leaned against my desk. "Good morning to you too, Mother. Is there a problem?" "A problem?" She gasped, the background noise of the busy grocery store bleeding through the speaker. I could hear the rhythmic beeping of a barcode scanner and the low murmur of impatient customers behind her. "Yes, there is a massive problem. I am standing at register 4 at Whole Foods. The cashier just tried to run the platinum card, and the machine declined it. It said the account was terminated. The manager is standing right here looking at me like I am some kind of criminal. You need to call your fraud department immediately and clear this up. They are holding up the entire line. I took a slow, deliberate breath, savoring the absolute desperation in her voice. The image of Barbara dressed in her designer athleisure wear, sweating under the fluorescent lights of a grocery store, while a teenage cashier rejected her payment was nothing short of cinematic. There is no fraud alert on the account. Mother, I replied, my voice cool and perfectly level. The terminal gave you the correct message. The card is permanently terminated. The line went dead silent for a fraction of a second, save for the ambient noise of the store. What are you talking about? She hissed, her tone dropping into a venomous whisper as she tried to hide her embarrassment from the people standing behind her. Lauren, stop playing games. I have $600 worth of groceries sitting in bags right now. We are hosting a celebration dinner tonight. Amanda and Terrence are coming over. Terrence specifically requested the imported black truffles for a risotto he wants to cook. I also have Wagyu steaks and 3 bottles of Cabernet in this cart. Pay for the groceries right now over the phone. The sheer entitlement was staggering. She had handed me an eviction notice on my birthday, kicked me out of the home I paid for, and now she was demanding I purchase imported truffles for the arrogant son-in-law who had cheered for my homelessness. I am not playing games, I stated simply. I am no longer funding your lifestyle. You made it abundantly clear on Friday night that I am not a valued member of your family. You told me I was just a tenant. You told me I was single and did not need space. You demanded I vacate my own property by midnight. I complied with your demands, but you forgot one crucial detail. Tenants do not pay their landlord's grocery bills. Tenants do not hand over a $5,000 monthly allowance. You cannot do this to me, she cried out, her voice cracking. Her panic was no longer about the embarrassment at the register. The terrifying reality of her financial situation was finally crashing down on her. We need those funds, Lauren. The mortgage payment is due on the 1st. We depend on that card for our daily expenses. You are being completely unreasonable. You cannot just cut off your own parents without warning. I checked my watch, watching the second hand sweep across the dial. You gave me less than 4 hours of warning to pack up my entire life and vacate my home, I reminded her smoothly. I think giving you 3 days of financial grace was actually quite generous. Lauren, please? She begged, dropping the aggressive demands entirely. The manager is tapping his foot. Everyone is staring at me. I do not have another card that will cover a $600 charge. My personal accounts are maxed out. Just unfreeze the card for 1 hour. Just let me pay for this cart, and we can sit down and discuss this like adults tomorrow. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window of my office, looking down at the tiny cars moving through the Seattle streets far below. There is nothing left to discuss, I said, my voice hardening into absolute ice. I am done being your human bank account. You made your choice. You chose Amanda. You chose Terrence. You evicted your sponsor. Let your tech genius son-in-law feed you now. I pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the red end call button, severing the connection right as she screamed my name. I tossed the device onto my desk and watched it immediately light up with another incoming call from her. I tapped the screen, blocked her number, and turned the phone face down on the polished wood surface. The absolute liberation I felt in that moment was intoxicating. The financial umbilical cord was permanently destroyed. They were completely on their own. I straightened my suit jacket, turned around, and walked back to the conference room to finalize my $50 million acquisition, leaving my mother stranded at a grocery store register with a cart full of rotting truffles and a shattered illusion of wealth. I spent the next 2 hours completely immersed in my acquisition deal, locking in the final terms for the robotics company, without a single thought spared for the grocery store meltdown. When the meeting adjourned and the startup founders shook my hand, I walked back to my private office with the quiet satisfaction of a predator who had just secured its catch. It was only when I sat back down at my mahogany desk and flipped my personal cell phone over that I saw the digital carnage. The screen was a solid wall of notifications. Since I had blocked my mother and father, the alerts were not direct calls from them. Instead, they were an endless stream of social media mentions, direct messages, and frantic text alerts from extended family members I had not spoken to in years. The backlash was incredibly predictable. When a toxic person loses control of their victim, their immediate reflex is to control how other people perceive the victim. Barbara and Amanda had gone absolutely nuclear. I unlocked my phone and opened Facebook. My mother's page, usually reserved for staging photos of her leased luxury car and catered country club lunches, had been transformed into a digital altar of martyrdom. She had posted a massive multi-paragraph essay tagging dozens of family members. The post was a masterclass in fabricated victimhood. She claimed that she and my father were facing severe financial hardship due to unexpected medical bills, a blatant lie designed to garner immediate sympathy, and that their cruel, ungrateful daughter had abruptly abandoned them in their hour of need. She painted a picture of herself weeping in the aisles of a grocery store, unable to buy basic sustenance, because I had maliciously drained their bank accounts out of pure spite. She completely omitted the fact that the accounts were mine, the money was mine, and the eviction notice she handed me on my birthday was the catalyst for the entire situation. She made sure to emphasize how she had sacrificed her entire life to raise me only to be tossed aside like garbage. Amanda took a different, far more theatrical approach on Instagram. She posted a tearful video reel gently holding her slightly pregnant belly while sitting in the pristine, expensively furnished living room of my parents' suburban mansion. She stared directly into the camera, squeezing out crocodile tears as she talked about the extreme stress her unborn baby was enduring. "My sister is so jealous of my marriage and my pregnancy that she is actively trying to destroy our parents to punish me," Amanda cried to her followers, wiping her eyes with a manicured hand. "She knows Terrence and I are working so hard on his new tech venture, and instead of supporting us, she cuts off the elderly parents who gave her everything. She is a monster who cares about nothing but herself. We are praying for her cold heart, but we have to protect our peace and our growing family from her toxic energy." The performance was nauseatingly perfect, designed to hit every emotional trigger point for her audience. The comment sections were a toxic wasteland of misplaced outrage. People who had never once checked on me, who had never bothered to ask how my career was going or how I was doing, were suddenly experts on my moral failings. The direct messages flooded my inbox like raw sewage. My aunt, a woman who routinely asked my parents for loans that were actually funded by my automatic transfers, sent a scathing paragraph. "How dare you abandon your parents after everything they did for you? You are an absolute disgrace to this family, and you should be ashamed to show your face." A cousin I had not seen since high school messaged me to say I was a bitter, aging spinster who was just furious that Amanda had secured a rich tech husband while I had nobody. They called me selfish, psychotic, and dangerous. They urged me to apologize to get psychiatric help and to immediately restore my parents' financial access before karma punished me for dishonoring my mother and father. The societal conditioning that family is family, no matter how abusive they are, was on full display. They wanted me to fall back into line to resume my position as the quiet, obedient punching bag, so the rest of the family ecosystem could continue functioning without disruption. In the past, an attack of this magnitude would have sent me into a spiral of severe anxiety. I would have drafted a dozen defensive responses, trying desperately to explain the truth, trying to prove my innocence to people who had already decided I was guilty. I would have begged them to understand about the eviction notice, the $100,000 apartment upgrades, and the 7 years of financial exploitation. I would have exhausted myself trying to manage their perception of me. But the woman sitting in the high-rise office was not the broken scapegoat they remembered. I did not type a single reply. I did not post a counter-statement defending my character. I did not even block them. Instead, I opened a secure encrypted folder on my desktop with thousands of followers. I captured my mother's written claims that I had stolen money from their accounts. In the United States legal system, defamation requires proving that false statements were published to third parties, causing reputational or financial harm. By publicly accusing a high-level venture capital partner of elder abuse and financial theft, Barbara and Amanda had crossed a very dangerous, highly actionable legal line. They were so blinded by their need for attention and sympathy that they did not realize they were handing me a loaded weapon. I compiled the massive digital dossier, attached it to a new email, and sent it directly to my corporate defamation attorney with a simple subject line requesting that he prepare the cease and desist orders and draft the civil litigation paperwork. Let them scream into the digital void and gather sympathy from their clueless audience. They were freely handing me all the evidence I needed to destroy them in a court of law when the time was right. I smiled, closed the social media tabs, and went back to work with complete peace of mind. Their digital temper tantrum was merely a pathetic distraction. They were desperately trying to control the narrative online because they had completely lost control of reality, and the real devastation was still waiting for them. They had not even visited the apartment yet. Saturday morning arrived with a thick layer of classic Seattle fog. I was sitting in my favorite downtown coffee shop enjoying a flawless matcha latte and reviewing a secondary portfolio when my personal phone alerted me that Terrence had just gone live on Instagram. I almost ignored it, but the title of his broadcast caught my eye. It read "New Headquarters Tour and Big Moves." He had been hyping up his relocation to a downtown luxury penthouse all week to his inflated follower count. I tapped the notification, settling into my leather chair for the entertainment. On the screen, Terrence was holding his phone high, wearing a designer hoodie he had undoubtedly purchased using the credit card I had just deactivated. Amanda was standing right behind him in the brightly lit hallway of my former building. She was barking orders at a team of overpriced hourly movers who were struggling to hold their cheap, oversized suburban furniture. Terrence flipped the camera around to show his face, flashing a highly rehearsed, arrogant smile at his audience. "What is up, innovators?" Terrence announced to his viewers, projecting the absolute confidence of a man who had never actually earned a dollar in his life. "We are officially upgrading today, moving into the new executive headquarters. Wait until you see this chef kitchen and the skyline view. This is where the magic is going to happen for my next big venture capital pitch. Success breeds success, people." He turned the camera toward the front door. He slid the generic brass key into the lock, the exact key I had left on the barren folding table just days prior. He pushed the heavy door open with a dramatic, sweeping flourish. "Welcome to the new empire," he declared proudly. He stepped inside, and the camera panned across the room. Instantly, the video feed captured a violent, shaky jerk. The echo inside the apartment was deafening, bouncing harshly off the empty walls. Instead of the gleaming quartz island, the imported German soft close cabinets, and the automated silk blinds he had promised his followers, the lens captured a barren, depressing expanse of scuffed subflooring and bare-patched drywall. The luxury he expected was entirely gone. Amanda pushed past him, her voice captured perfectly on the live audio feed. She let out a high-pitched shriek of absolute horror. "What happened?" she screamed, her voice cracking with hysteria. "Where is everything? Where is the smart fridge? Where are the crystal chandeliers?" Terrence was frozen in place. The camera was now pointing directly at the cheap stained laminate flooring, but the audio remained crisp and clear. "Did we get robbed?" Amanda yelled, her footsteps echoing loudly as she ran frantically from room to room. Terrence dropped his influencer persona completely. "The kitchen is gone," he gasped, his voice trembling with a level of panic I had never heard from him before. "Amanda, the kitchen is completely gone. The appliances are ripped out of the walls." His specific, desperate panic was incredibly satisfying to witness. Terrence had booked a professional high-end videography crew to arrive at the apartment in exactly 45 minutes. He needed to shoot a highly polished Series A funding pitch video for his failing tech startup. In the venture capital world, he desperately wanted to belong to projecting extreme wealth and stability was half the battle. He had told his prospective investors that he operated out of a multi-million-dollar state-of-the-art smart home to validate his current entirely fabricated company valuation. He needed my luxury kitchen as his primary background set. He needed my custom lighting to make him look like a proven winner. I cannot shoot a tech pitch in a gutted concrete box. Terrence shouted the reality of his situation crashing down on him. I look like a squatter. The investors are going to think I am bankrupt. From the back of the apartment, Amanda let out another piercing scream. She had just discovered the master bathroom. The soaking tub is missing. She wailed, her voice echoing down the empty hallway. There is a plastic utility sink in here. It looks like a public gas station restroom. Lauren took everything. She took the toilets. The movers, who were still standing out in the hallway holding a heavy velvet sofa, looked extremely confused. Sir," one of them asked hesitantly, leaning into the doorway. "Where do you want us to put this couch?" Terrence completely lost his mind. "Put it anywhere," he roared, his voice cracking under the immense pressure. "Put it in the garbage. My entire investment pitch is ruined. Everything is ruined." Suddenly, Terrence realized he was still broadcasting live to over 200 of his followers. He scrambled to lift the phone, his face a mask of absolute humiliation and dread. He swore loudly, fumbling with the screen, before the video feed abruptly went black. I took a slow, calm sip of my matcha latte. Terrence had built his entire entrepreneurial identity on a foundation of lies and borrowed luxury. He believed that he could just waltz into my life, kick me out, and assume my level of success by simply stealing my physical space. He fundamentally misunderstood that the deed to the property only gave them ownership of the empty shell. I owned the lifestyle, and I had taken it with me. Without my imported fixtures, my automated climate systems, and my smart appliances, he was just a desperate, failing amateur standing in an empty room with a terrible business plan. 10 minutes later, the head concierge of the building, a sharp and discreet man named David, whom I had tipped extremely well over the past 5 years, sent me a text message. I smiled as I read it on my screen. "Your sister is having a full mental breakdown in the lobby," David wrote. "Her husband is yelling at the moving crew and begging a videographer to cancel an appointment. Just thought you should know the keys were picked up." I replied with a simple thank you and transferred a $500 bonus to David's account for the excellent customer service. Amanda genuinely thought she was getting a free, effortless upgrade to a luxury penthouse. Terrence thought he was getting a free multi-million-dollar production studio to scam his investors. They had both arrogantly assumed that I would leave my hard-earned assets behind for them to exploit. Instead, they were now standing in a hollow, freezing construction zone surrounded by cheap baseboards and exposed plumbing stubs. Their grand victory had transformed into a humiliating logistical and financial nightmare. Amanda would refuse to live in a place without a functioning luxury bathroom, and Terrence had just lost the very last shred of credibility he had for his startup. The fallout was accelerating beautifully, and I knew that the next phase of their desperation was imminent. They were going to try to strike back, but they had absolutely no leverage left. Less than an hour after David the concierge texted me, my personal cell phone illuminated with an incoming call. The caller ID displayed my father's name. I let it ring a few times, enjoying the rhythm of his mounting desperation, before I finally swiped the screen to answer. I did not even have the chance to offer a polite greeting before his voice exploded through the speaker. "Are you out of your mind?" Thomas roared. His voice was completely unhinged, vibrating with a level of pure, unrestrained fury I had never heard from him before. "I am standing in the middle of our investment property, and it looks like a war zone. You destroyed our property, Lauren. You stripped the entire place to the studs. I am calling the police right now. I am having you arrested for grand larceny, felony vandalism, and malicious destruction of property. You are going to prison for this. I pulled the phone slightly away from my ear, leaning back in my plush office chair. I let him scream until he literally ran out of breath. I listened to him panting heavily on the other end of the line. The background noise revealed the hollow, echoing acoustics of the gutted apartment. I could faintly hear Amanda sobbing in the distance, likely sitting on the floor of the barren living room. "Are you quite finished, Thomas?" I asked. My voice was dangerously quiet and completely devoid of any emotion. "I am just getting started," he snarled back, though his volume had dropped slightly in response to my unnatural calm. "You stole the kitchen appliances. You stole the bathroom fixtures. You took the lighting. Terrence is in the hallway having a panic attack because he had a film crew arriving to shoot a corporate video and you ruined it. You committed a massive felony, and I am going to make sure you pay for every single bit of damage." I clicked open my email client on my desktop. "I did not cause a single dollar of structural damage to your property," I replied smoothly. "I did not smash any drywall. I did not break any windows. I simply packed up my personal belongings and vacated the premises exactly as you demanded on my birthday. I left the property broom swept and secure." "Those were permanent fixtures," he shouted, his anger flaring up again. "You cannot just unbolt a custom quartz kitchen island and walk out the door. That is theft." I tapped the trackpad on my computer. "I suggest you open your email inbox right now, Thomas. I just sent you a rather large file. You might want to review it before you dial emergency services and embarrass yourself in front of the Seattle Police Department." There was a tense silence on the line, followed by the faint rustling of clothing and a muted ping as the email hit his smartphone. "What is this?" he demanded suspiciously. "That is a 400-page encrypted PDF document," I explained, keeping my steady, measured pace. "It contains the legally binding receipts, contractor invoices, and paid-in-full statements for every single item I extracted from that apartment last night. Every appliance, every light fixture, every piece of imported hardwood, and every smart home device has a corresponding receipt with my name printed clearly at the top. I paid for all of it using my personal funds." He scoffed loudly, but the sound was shaky and lacked conviction. "That does not matter. Once you attach something to a property, it becomes the property of the landlord. It is basic real estate law." I smiled at the screen. "You should really consult an actual attorney before you try to practice law, Thomas. Under the specific landlord-tenant codes of this state, tenant improvements paid for exclusively by the tenant, without any financial reimbursement from the landlord, remain the personal property of the tenant. I am legally entitled to extract my assets provided I return the premises to a legally habitable state. If you check the bathrooms, you will find that I installed a functioning utility sink, a standard showerhead, and a builder-grade toilet. I capped all the plumbing lines to code. I left you a perfectly habitable bare minimum apartment. It is exactly what you paid for. Nothing." I listened closely. The silence on his end was absolute. He was frantically scrolling through the massive PDF on his phone, staring at the undeniable paper trail of my financial contributions. He was looking at the contractor agreements that specifically designated me as the sole owner of the materials. He was slowly realizing that calling the police would result in the officers laughing in his face and telling him it was a civil matter he was guaranteed to lose. "You cannot do this," he finally stammered, all the aggressive bluster entirely draining from his voice. "Amanda is pregnant. She is standing here crying her eyes out. They were supposed to move into a luxury home today. How could you be so cruel to your own sister? How could you leave them with a concrete box?" I swiveled my chair around to look out the window. "You handed me an eviction notice while I was blowing out my birthday candle," I reminded him coldly. "You gave me 4 hours to pack up my entire life so your golden child could have my space for free. Do not dare lecture me on family morality or cruelty. You wanted the apartment. I gave you the apartment. I simply declined to give you my lifestyle along with it. Lauren, please." Thomas pleaded, his tone shifting into a desperate, pathetic attempt at manipulation. "We can fix this. Just bring the appliances back. Terrence needs the background for his company pitch. We can draft a new lease. We can work something out. There is nothing left to work out, I stated. My voice was absolute ice. You and Barbara made your choices. You chose to treat me like a disposable ATM. Now you get to experience life without my subsidies. What are you talking about? He asked, confusion masking his panic. I leaned forward, bringing the phone closer to my mouth to ensure he heard every single syllable of my final strike. I am talking about your financial reality, Thomas. By the way, the mortgage on that empty apartment is $3,800. The property tax installment is also coming up. Both are due on the 1st of the month. A suffocating silence filled the receiver. He knew exactly what day it was. He knew the 1st of the month was only days away. I canceled the automated transfer this morning. I delivered the final crushing blow. The credit cards are permanently revoked. The accounts are locked. You evicted your sponsor. Good luck paying that mortgage without my $5,000. I pressed the end call button before he could even draw a breath to respond. I set the phone down on my desk, a profound sense of victory settling deep into my bones. The trap had officially snapped shut. They were standing in an empty, echoing shell of an apartment holding a massive mortgage they could not possibly afford with absolutely zero access to my cash. The real consequences of their arrogant greed were about to tear their perfect fake lives apart piece by piece. The real consequences of their arrogant greed were about to tear their perfect fake lives apart piece by piece. The 1st of the month arrived with the absolute ruthlessness of a ticking time bomb. For 7 years, my family had treated the 1st of the month as a day of effortless renewal. Their bank accounts would magically replenish, their minimum payments would clear, and their grand illusion of generational wealth would seamlessly roll over into the next 30 days. But this month, the financial well was completely dry. I sat in my office and imagined the exact sequence of their digital dominoes falling. First, the automated mortgage withdrawal for their sprawling suburban mansion would hit their primary checking account and violently bounce back due to insufficient funds. Then the lease payments for their matching luxury SUVs would trigger overdraft fees. Finally, the country club dues, the utility bills, and the premium grocery delivery subscriptions would all simultaneously fail. The panic must have been suffocating. My mother Barbara had constructed her entire social identity around the ability to swipe a piece of plastic without ever looking at the price tag. Now she was a woman trapped in a very expensive cage with absolutely zero liquid capital. And she was not the only one drowning. Terrence, the self-proclaimed tech visionary, was suddenly facing the catastrophic reality of his own hollow business model. His entire startup was burning through cash at an astronomical rate, primarily because he had been secretly relying on my mother to cover his server hosting fees and marketing expenses using the supplementary platinum card I had just shredded. Without my luxury kitchen to serve as a fake production studio, his venture capital pitch had been delayed. Without the endless flow of my stolen money, his cloud storage accounts were facing imminent suspension. He was bleeding cash, and the pressure from his pregnant, highly entitled wife was undoubtedly pushing him to the brink of a total breakdown. Amanda and Terrence were currently living a nightmare. They had arrogantly moved into the downtown apartment expecting a turnkey palace. Instead, they were stuck in a gutted, echoing concrete box. They had absolutely no disposable income to purchase new appliances, let alone custom cabinetry or luxury bathroom fixtures. I envisioned them sleeping on cheap air mattresses in the center of the barren master bedroom, relying on a plastic utility sink to brush their teeth. The sheer poetic justice of their living situation was incredibly satisfying. They had demanded space, and I had given them an abundance of empty, freezing, unfurnished space. By the second week of the month, their desperation reached a boiling point. The relentless calls and text messages from my parents had completely ceased, replaced by an eerie, calculated silence. I knew they were plotting. Thomas was a man who refused to ever admit defeat. If he could not bully me into submission over the phone, he would attempt to use the legal system to bludgeon me back into my role as the compliant family scapegoat. He genuinely believed that because I had quietly funded them for years, I was weak and easily intimidated by authority. My suspicions were confirmed on a rainy Thursday afternoon. I was sitting at my mahogany desk reviewing quarterly projections for my venture capital portfolio when my executive assistant knocked on the heavy glass door. She stepped into my office holding a thick manila envelope delivered via certified mail. "It requires your direct signature," she noted, handing me the clipboard. I signed the receipt and took the envelope. A quick glance at the return address told me everything I needed to know. The letter was sent from a discount strip mall legal clinic located deep in the suburbs, the exact kind of budget law firm that specialized in desperate personal injury claims and aggressive baseless extortion attempts. Thomas and Barbara could not even afford a proper downtown litigator. They had scraped the bottom of the barrel to hire a legal mercenary. I sliced the envelope open with a silver letter opener and pulled out a highly embellished, aggressively worded demand letter. I read through the document, a cold smile slowly spreading across my face. The sheer audacity of their legal strategy was breathtaking. The attorney had drafted a formal demand for $100,000 payable immediately to Thomas and Barbara, under the threat of aggressive civil litigation. The justification for this absurd sum was categorized as severe intentional infliction of emotional distress resulting from my malicious destruction of their residential property and my abrupt, cruel abandonment of my familial duties. But the most amusing part of the document was the legal precedent their budget lawyer was attempting to invoke. He cited an obscure, archaic set of statutes known as filial responsibility laws. These are ancient, rarely enforced laws that technically require adult children to financially support their impoverished elderly parents if the parents are entirely incapable of providing for themselves and are at risk of becoming wards of the state. Thomas and Barbara were literally trying to sue me for parental child support. They were officially claiming to be destitute, impoverished seniors in order to legally force me to resume my $5,000 monthly payments and hand over a massive lump sum of cash to fix the apartment I had gutted. They were trying to extort me using the very poverty they had brought upon themselves. The demand letter stated that if I did not wire the $100,000 to their legal counsel within 10 business days, they would file a public lawsuit dragging my name through the mud and exposing my ungrateful behavior to the court of public opinion. They were banking on the assumption that I would be terrified of a public scandal and would quietly pay the ransom to make them go away. They assumed I would fold under the pressure of a formal legal threat. I did not panic. I did not feel a single ounce of fear. Instead, I felt a surge of pure predatory anticipation. I picked up my desk phone and dialed the direct line to my firm's retained corporate litigator, a man who charged more per hour than my parents' budget lawyer made in a month. I requested an immediate meeting. I gathered the absurd demand letter, my massive digital dossier of their defamatory social media posts, and the flawless legal receipts, proving my sole ownership of the extracted apartment fixtures. I was not going to write them a check. I was going to grant their request for a legal mediation session. I wanted to sit across a polished conference table from them. I wanted to look them directly in the eyes while they desperately tried to extort a woman who possessed enough financial firepower to crush their entire existence. The extortion attempt was their final fatal mistake. They had just invited a shark to a feeding frenzy. 2 weeks later, the preliminary legal mediation took place in a neutral glass-walled conference room located in a highly prestigious downtown Seattle high-rise. The setting was intentionally intimidating. I arrived early with my lead corporate litigator, Mr. Cole. He was a ruthless, brilliantly sharp attorney whose hourly rate alone probably exceeded the entire remaining balance in my parents' checking account. We sat on one side of the massive polished oak table, our immaculate files arranged in perfect alignment. At precisely 10 o'clock, my family arrived. The visual contrast was instantly striking. Thomas and Barbara marched into the room, attempting to project their usual upper-middle-class superiority, but the cracks in their facade were glaringly obvious. Barbara was wearing a designer dress from a past season, her posture rigid with a desperate, frantic energy. Thomas looked exhausted, the heavy bags under his eyes betraying the sleepless nights caused by his impending mortgage default. Amanda trailed behind them, clutching her designer purse like a shield, while Terrence walked in with his chest puffed out aggressively, overcompensating for his underlying panic. Leading their pathetic procession was their discount attorney, a man named Mr. Evans, who looked entirely out of his depth. His suit was slightly wrinkled, and he nervously shuffled his disorganized paperwork as he took his seat across from Mr. Cole. The mediator, a neutral third-party judge, initiated the proceedings by outlining the basic rules of conduct. Mr. Evans immediately launched into his opening statement. He stumbled over his own words, attempting to forcefully present the absurd demand for $100,000 in emotional damages. He desperately tried to invoke the archaic filial responsibility laws, arguing that my parents were destitute seniors who had been maliciously abandoned by their wealthy, ungrateful daughter. He claimed that my extraction of the luxury apartment fixtures had caused Amanda severe psychological trauma during her pregnancy. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting calmly on the table. I did not interrupt. I did not roll my eyes. I simply watched them with the cold, detached fascination of a scientist observing desperate lab rats. Mr. Cole let the opposing counsel finish his rambling monologue. When Mr. Evans finally paused for breath, Mr. Cole calmly adjusted his glasses and prepared to dismantle their entire legal argument. But before my attorney could even speak a single word, Terrence lost his temper. The silence from my side of the table clearly unnerved my brother-in-law. Terrence could not handle the quiet, suffocating pressure of the room. He slammed his hand flat against the oak table, completely ignoring the mediator and his own attorney. "You think you are so smart?" Lauren Terrence sneered, leaning aggressively across the table. His voice was loud, echoing harshly against the glass walls. "You sit there in your fancy suit, acting like you are untouchable just because you have a decent consulting job. You gutted that apartment out of pure, bitter jealousy. You are just a miserable, lonely woman who cannot stand the fact that Amanda and I are building a real family and a real legacy." Mr. Evans frantically whispered for Terrence to remain quiet, but Terrence aggressively waved him off. His fragile tech bro ego was entirely bruised, and he needed to assert his dominance. "You think cutting off Thomas and Barbara makes you powerful?" Terrence continued, a mocking, arrogant smirk spreading across his face. "You think you are starving us out? Well, I have news for you. We do not need your pathetic $5,000 a month. We do not need you at all. I am days away from closing a massive Series A funding round for my tech startup." I kept my expression entirely neutral, but inside a surge of pure adrenaline electrified my veins. He was actually going to pitch his fake company during a legal mediation. "I am securing $10 million in venture capital from one of the premier investment firms in Seattle," Terrence bragged, his chest expanding with absolute delusion. "My valuation is through the roof. The partners at the firm love my app. The paperwork is practically signed. Once that cash hits my accounts, I am going to be filthy rich. I am going to buy Amanda a real mansion, a property 10 times better than that concrete box you left us. And when I am a multimillionaire, you are never seeing a single dime of my money. You could be starving on the street and I would step right over you." He glared at me, breathing heavily, expecting me to react. He wanted me to yell. He wanted me to defend my career or express jealousy over his impending wealth. He wanted the satisfaction of knowing he had finally put the bitter single sister in her place. I did not argue with him. I did not correct his completely fabricated company valuation. I did not point out that his mobile app was a hollow, malfunctioning prototype that had 0 active users. And most importantly, I absolutely did not tell him that I was the anonymous senior partner at the exact venture capital firm currently reviewing his desperate funding application. I slowly turned my head and exchanged a brief knowing glance with Mr. Cole. My attorney caught the absolute predatory gleam in my eye. We both knew that Terrence had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to permanently destroy his financial future. I looked back at Terrence and simply smirked. It was a cold, terrifying smile that completely unsettled him. I stayed absolutely silent, allowing his arrogant words to hang heavily in the air, granting him all the rope he needed to hang himself. Mr. Cole smoothly took control of the room. He slid a thick-bound folder across the table to Mr. Evans. "My client declines your extortion attempt in its entirety," Mr. Cole stated, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "Contained in this folder are the legally binding receipts, proving my client owns every fixture extracted from the apartment. Additionally, you will find time-stamped documentation of your clients publishing defamatory statements across multiple social media platforms, falsely accusing my client of financial crimes." Mr. Evans opened the folder, the color rapidly draining from his face as he realized the sheer magnitude of the evidence against them. "If your clients pursue this baseless lawsuit," Mr. Cole continued, "or if they attempt to contact my client again for any reason, we will immediately file a countersuit for severe defamation, targeted harassment, and extortion. We will bankrupt you in legal fees before this even reaches a courtroom. This mediation is concluded." I stood up gracefully, buttoned my suit jacket, and walked out of the conference room without saying a single word to my family. They sat frozen at the table, completely paralyzed by the swift, brutal rejection of their demands. Terrence likely believed his aggressive outburst had intimidated me into silence. He genuinely thought he had won the psychological battle. He had no idea that his arrogant bragging had just paved the way for a catastrophic financial slaughter. He was walking blindly into a devastating trap, and the upcoming Thanksgiving holiday was going to be the perfect stage for his absolute ruin. November arrived in Seattle with a biting, relentless cold that stripped the remaining leaves from the trees and cast a perpetual gray pall over the entire city. Inside my heated high-rise office, the atmosphere was entirely different. It was electric. For the past several weeks following the disastrous legal mediation, I had dedicated a specific portion of my daily schedule to meticulously reviewing the financial anatomy of my brother-in-law's technology startup. Terrence had swaggered into that conference room and boasted about securing a $10 million funding round. He had arrogantly thrown his impending wealth in my face. What he fundamentally failed to grasp was how the venture capital ecosystem actually operated. He assumed that a flashy pitch deck and a few trending buzzwords were enough to secure a massive check from seasoned investors. My junior analysts had torn his business model to absolute shreds. The application Terrence was pitching was nothing more than a poorly coded user interface wrapped around an impossible set of logistical promises. He had zero proprietary technology. He had massive crippling liabilities. He had been taking out high-interest short-term predatory loans just to keep his servers running and to pay for the highly produced marketing videos he shot to deceive casual investors. His company was a gaping financial black hole. And yet, because I was the silent senior partner who held the ultimate veto power over this specific investment tier, I instructed my team to keep his application actively pending. I let him dangle on the hook, entirely convinced that his massive payout was imminent. Then the unexpected piece of mail arrived. I was returning to my penthouse from a morning workout when the building concierge handed me a thick cream-colored envelope. The heavy cardstock and gold-embossed lettering were instantly recognizable. It was a formal invitation to a Thanksgiving dinner hosted by Thomas and Barbara at their primary suburban mansion. I stood in the marble lobby staring at the elegant calligraphy, a cold laugh escaping my lips. The sheer, unadulterated spite behind this invitation was magnificent. It was a textbook narcissistic maneuver. My parents were currently drowning in a sea of unpaid bills. Without my $5,000 monthly transfer, their mortgage was severely delinquent. Their luxury car leases were slipping into default status. Yet they were choosing to drain whatever microscopic limit remained on their final credit cards to host a lavish holiday feast. Why? Because they desperately needed an audience. They needed to parade Terrence and his completely fabricated multi-million-dollar tech deal in front of me. They wanted me to sit at their dining table and watch them celebrate the golden child and her supposedly brilliant husband. They invited me solely to watch me suffer, hoping I would realize the massive error of my ways and beg to be allowed back into their good graces. before Terrence became insanely wealthy. They wanted me to witness my own replacement. They desperately wanted to prove that my financial cutoff had not destroyed them and that they were moving on to a much higher echelon of society. I walked into my penthouse, placed the invitation on the kitchen counter, and immediately drafted a polite brief email confirming my attendance. I was not going to give them the satisfaction of an angry rejection. I was going to give them exactly what they asked for. I was going to show up. The week leading up to Thanksgiving was a masterclass in strategic preparation. While my mother was undoubtedly obsessing over expensive floral centerpieces and ordering catered turkeys she could not afford, I was finalizing a series of aggressive corporate debt acquisitions. My venture capital firm did not just invest in startups. We also possessed a highly specialized division dedicated to purchasing distressed debt and liquidating toxic assets. I had authorized my team to quietly buy up the predatory loans Terrence had defaulted on. I was systematically surrounding them, sealing every possible exit. When Thanksgiving Thursday finally arrived, I approached my closet to select my armor. I bypassed the casual holiday sweaters and comfortable dresses. If I was walking into a war zone disguised as a family dinner, I was going to look the part. I chose a custom-tailored charcoal gray designer suit constructed from razor-sharp Italian wool. I paired it with a crisp white silk blouse and black stiletto heels that clicked with absolute authority on the hardwood floor. I wore minimal jewelry, save for a luxury timepiece that cost more than my parents' current liquid net worth. I looked exactly like the ruthless, high-powered executive I actually was. I did not look like a defeated daughter coming to beg for forgiveness. I looked like a corporate Grim Reaper. I drove my vehicle through the familiar winding streets of their upscale suburban neighborhood. The massive oak trees lining the road were bare against the darkening November sky. As I pulled up to the wrought iron gates of my parents' estate, I noted the absurd display of fake wealth. The driveway was packed with the least luxury vehicles of extended family members and neighborhood socialites. Every window of the sprawling mansion was glowing with warm, inviting light. I could see the silhouettes of guests mingling in the grand foyer, holding wine glasses and laughing. I parked my car on the street, took a slow, deep breath of the freezing evening air, and walked up the long stone pathway toward the massive oak front doors. The crisp sound of my heels striking the pavement felt like a ticking clock, marking the final moments of their illusion. I did not bother ringing the doorbell. I simply turned the heavy brass handle and pushed the doors open, stepping directly into the lion's den. The entryway smelled of roasted meats, expensive cinnamon candles, and absolute delusion. The dull roar of conversation washed over me. I stood in the foyer, slowly unbuttoning my tailored jacket, my eyes scanning the room. I was ready to face them. I was ready to let them put on their pathetic, boastful performance. I was going to let them inflate their egos to the absolute maximum capacity right before I plunged the needle in and popped their entire reality. I stepped into the grand living room, my charcoal gray suit commanding immediate attention against the sea of autumnal cashmere. The scale of their financial delusion was staggering. The dining table overflowed with an extravagant catered feast. Imported orchids dominated every surface. A hired string quartet played softly. Barbara had clearly emptied her microscopic high-interest credit lines to fund this opulent masquerade. She spotted me instantly. The fake pearly white smile plastered across her face looked painful. She glided across the room with a glass of champagne, ensuring her friends watched our interaction. "Lauren, you actually showed up?" Barbara announced, her voice pitched loud enough for the nearest guests to hear. "I am honestly surprised. After your little tantrum last month, I thought you would be too embarrassed to show your face among successful people." "I would never miss a family celebration, Mother," I replied, my tone dangerously smooth. "I wanted to see exactly how you were managing your new lifestyle." Barbara's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a brief flash of panic in her eyes, before she quickly masked it with haughty arrogance. "We are managing beautifully, as you can see. Real wealth always finds a way to endure." Before I could point out the absolute absurdity of her statement, Amanda waddled over. My younger sister was draped in a ridiculously expensive silk maternity gown, resting one hand heavily on her bump to ensure everyone remembered she was the center of attention. She looked me up and down, her eyes full of undisguised contempt. "Look who decided to crawl back," Amanda sneered, taking a sip from a sparkling cider flute. "You look incredibly stiff, Lauren. But I suppose when you are 33 single and living in some cheap rental, you have to dress up in stiff business suits just to feel important." I maintained my calm, predatory gaze. "I dress for the reality of my life, Amanda. You should try it sometime." She completely missed the warning in my words, interpreting my calm demeanor as weakness. "My reality is perfect," she bragged. "Terrence is closing his venture capital deal. We are going to be obscenely wealthy. We are already looking at estates in Medina. Meanwhile, you are completely alone. You tried to ruin us by throwing a fit over that stupid apartment, but all you did was cut yourself out of our new billionaire lifestyle. You played yourself, Lauren." "We will see about that," I said softly. The circle around us widened as Thomas and Terrence approached. My father held a crystal tumbler of top-shelf scotch, his chest puffed out with manufactured pride. Terrence walked beside him, looking every bit the arrogant tech bro in a designer turtleneck and a luxury sports watch. He was practically vibrating with nervous, caffeinated energy. He thought he was the king of the world, entirely oblivious to the financial guillotine hanging directly over his neck. Lauren Thomas boomed, drawing the attention of the surrounding relatives and neighbors. "I am glad you had the sense to come tonight. It shows that you are finally ready to admit your massive mistakes." I raised a single eyebrow. "Mistakes, Thomas? Do not play coy with me," he barked, pointing a finger at my chest. "You acted like a spoiled, jealous brat. You gutted our property and disrespected this family. But tonight is a night of giving thanks and showing grace. Terrence is about to finalize a $10 million funding round. His company is exploding. Your mother and I have decided that we will allow you back into this family, but under one strict condition." Terrence smirked, crossing his arms over his chest. "That is right, Lauren. I am a generous guy. I know you are probably struggling financially now that you do not have that fancy apartment to hide behind. I am willing to be the bigger person. Get to the point," I said, my voice dropping to a glacial chill. Thomas stepped closer, his face flushed with scotch and unearned authority. "You are going to apologize to your sister, and to us right here, right now. Then you are going to beg Terrence for a job. He needs a low-level administrative assistant to manage his new corporate office. It pays minimum wage, but it will keep you off the streets. You swallow your pride, you apologize, and you take the job. That is your only path back into this family." I stared at my father, absorbing the absolute staggering delusion of his demand. He wanted me to beg a broke, failing fraud for a minimum wage job. I opened my mouth to deliver the first devastating blow, but before a single word could escape my lips, the grand brass doorbell echoed loudly through the cavernous foyer. The resonant chime cut through the party chatter. The string quartet stopped playing. Terrence literally jumped, his eyes lighting up with manic, desperate excitement. "That is him," Terrence shouted, turning to the crowd with a massive, victorious grin. "That is the very important guest I was telling you all about, the representative from the venture capital firm in Seattle. They promised to send an executive courier tonight with the finalized term sheets." A gasp of awe rippled through the gathered socialites and extended family members. My mother clasped her hands together in sheer delight, tears of joy welling in her eyes. Thomas patted Terrence firmly on the back, looking at me with an expression of absolute triumph. "Watch and learn," Lauren Thomas sneered. "This is what real success looks like." The entire family practically tripped over themselves, rushing toward the grand entryway to welcome their financial savior. I followed slowly behind them, the crisp click of my stilettos completely masked by their excited chatter. I watched as Thomas dramatically pulled open the massive double mahogany doors. Standing on the front porch was a sharply dressed man in a dark tailored suit. He looked incredibly professional, entirely unbothered by the freezing November wind. In his right hand, he held a sleek black leather portfolio bearing the discreet silver-embossed logo of my venture capital firm. My mother shrieked with delight. Amanda clutched Terrence by his arm, practically bouncing on her heels. They were staring at that leather portfolio as if it contained a winning lottery ticket. They expected him to pull out a ceremonial check and hand it to Terrence. They were practically salivating at the mouth, blinded by their greed and desperate desire for validation. They had no idea the destruction awaiting them inside that leather case. Terrence lunges forward, extending his hand with a wide, desperate grin. "Welcome, welcome to our home," he announces, projecting his voice so every single guest in the foyer can hear him. "I am Terrence, founder and CEO. We have been expecting you." He gestures expansively toward the grand living room. "Let us head straight to the study to finalize the paperwork. I have a vintage bottle of champagne waiting on ice to celebrate our partnership." The executive assistant, a sharp, impeccably dressed professional named Hayes, steps over the threshold. He does not take the outstretched hand. He does not even offer a polite, obligatory smile. His eyes scan the crowded foyer, sweeping right past the expensive floral arrangements, past the catered appetizers, and past the stunned faces of my parents, until his gaze locks directly onto me. Hayes navigates through the sea of extended family members. They part for him, instinctively sensing the heavy corporate authority radiating from his posture. Terrence stands with his hands still suspended in midair, his arrogant grin slowly dissolving into a mask of pure, unadulterated confusion. "Excuse me," Terrence barks, his voice cracking slightly as his ego sustains a direct hit. "The study is this way. You are walking toward my sister-in-law. She does not work for my company." Hayes ignores him completely. He stops exactly 2 feet in front of me, planting his feet firmly on the imported marble tile. The entire mansion goes dead silent. The clinking of crystal glasses ceases. The muted chatter of 50 guests evaporates into nothingness. The string quartet in the background awkwardly trails off, leaving a heavy, suffocating tension in the air. Hayes bows his head slightly, in a gesture of absolute, unyielding professional reverence. He extends the heavy black leather portfolio toward me, presenting it with both hands. Boss Hayes announces, his voice carrying clearly and sharply across the silent foyer. "The debt acquisition files and immediate liquidation notices for Terrence's startup are finalized and ready for your signature." The impact of those 20 words hits the room like a seismic shockwave. Terrence stumbles backward as if he has been physically struck. His mouth opens and closes, but no sound comes out. Amanda lets out a high-pitched, strangled gasp, clutching her maternity dress. Thomas actually drops his crystal tumbler. It shatters loudly against the marble floor, splashing expensive scotch across the polished stone, but nobody even looks down. Barbara freezes her eyes, darting frantically between me, the assistant, and the leather portfolio, her brain desperately trying to reject the reality unfolding right in front of her face. "There has been a colossal mistake," Thomas finally sputters, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. "That man is confused. Lauren is an unemployed consultant. She was just evicted. Tell him, Terrence. Tell him he has the wrong person." Terrence rushes forward, sweat instantly beading on his forehead. "Hey, buddy," he stammers aggressively, pointing a trembling finger at Hayes. "You have the wrong file. I am supposed to be signing a $10 million Series A term sheet today. You are talking to my broke sister-in-law. Who is your supervisor? I demand to speak to the managing partner of the firm immediately." Hayes finally turns his head to look at Terrence. His expression is completely devoid of pity. He looks at my brother-in-law the way an exterminator looks at a pest. "I am speaking to the managing partner," Hayes replies coldly. "She is standing right in front of you." The remaining air is violently sucked out of the room. I take the leather portfolio from Hayes, the soft premium material cool against my fingertips. I unclasp the silver lock and open it, revealing a thick stack of legal documents stamped with urgent red foreclosure and liquidation seals. I pull a custom silver fountain pen from the inner pocket of my charcoal suit jacket. You asked me to beg you for a minimum wage job, Terrence. I say, my voice slicing effortlessly through the heavy silence. I do not raise my volume. I do not need to. True power does not shout. You stood in that mediation room and bragged that you were going to be a multimillionaire. You promised that when you were rich you would step right over me while I starved on the street. I uncap the fountain pen. The sharp metallic click echoes loudly in the foyer. What you did not realize. I continue locking eyes with my terrified brother-in-law, is that venture capital firms do not just hand out $10 million checks to anyone with a flashy pitch deck and a rented turtleneck. We conduct deep forensic due diligence. We looked into your servers. We looked into your user acquisition metrics. We looked into the predatory high-interest loans you took out to fund your fake lifestyle. Actual visible tremors rack his body. He takes another step back, bumping into the entryway table. Amanda reaches for his arm, but he completely ignores her, his eyes glued to the documents in my hands. You have zero proprietary technology, I state, outlining his failure for the entire room to hear. Your code is copied from open-source libraries. You have zero active daily users. You have been burning cash to shoot promotional videos in the luxury kitchen you thought you were stealing from me. Your company is a complete and total fraud, Terrence. No. Amanda screams, her voice shrill and hysterical. She is lying. Terrence, tell them she is lying. You are getting the funding. You promised we were buying a mansion. Terrence cannot even look at his wife. He is staring at the pen in my hand, fully realizing the catastrophic magnitude of his error. When my analysts presented your garbage application to the board, I explained, turning my attention back to the portfolio. I had two choices. I could have simply rejected your funding request and let you slowly bleed to death in bankruptcy court. But that would have been entirely too passive. I looked directly at my father. You taught me that whoever holds the paper owns the asset. So I took your advice. I instructed my distressed asset division to buy up every single one of Terrence's defaulted loans from his creditors. I pressed the tip of my fountain pen to the thick, textured paper of the first liquidation notice. I did not come here to invest in you, Terrence, I say, signing my name with swift, aggressive strokes. I came here to collect. As of this exact moment, my firm owns your entire company, all your intellectual property, and every single piece of business equipment you possess. And because you foolishly offered personal guarantees on those predatory loans, we are seizing your personal bank accounts as well. I flip to the next page and sign it. The scratch of the nib against the paper is the only sound in the house. I flip to the third page. Signature. Fourth page. Signature. With every stroke of my pen, I am systematically wiping out his entire fake empire. I hand the portfolio back to Hayes. File these with the bankruptcy court immediately. Freeze his assets. Send the repo teams to his server farm. Right away, Boss Hayes replies, taking the portfolio and bowing his head once more before turning around and walking out the front doors, disappearing into the freezing November night. I stand in the center of the grand foyer, surrounded by my devastated family. The extended family members, the aunts, uncles, and wealthy neighbors who had gleefully attended this dinner to celebrate my downfall are now pressing themselves against the walls. They are whispering frantically to one another, their eyes wide with shock, as they witness the complete dismantling of the illusion they had all bought into. Terrence drops to his knees, his hands covering his face as a strangled sob escapes his throat. Amanda collapses against the wall, weeping uncontrollably. Barbara covers her mouth with trembling hands, her eyes wide with unadulterated terror. They invited me here to witness my replacement. Instead, I had just executed a flawless public financial execution. But the night was not over. The appetizer was finished and it was time to serve the main course. I turned my predatory gaze toward Thomas and Barbara, my charcoal suit acting as the perfect armor for the final blow. The grand foyer of my parents' mansion felt entirely devoid of oxygen. Terrence remained crumpled on the imported marble floor, his hands still clutching his head, letting out low, guttural sounds of absolute defeat. Amanda was hyperventilating against the wall, her hands sliding down her silk maternity dress, as the crushing reality of her shattered billionaire fantasy took hold. The hired string quartet had completely vanished into the background, leaving only the deafening silence of a ruined Thanksgiving dinner. Thomas stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. "You cannot be a senior partner." He finally managed to stammer his voice, completely devoid of its usual booming authority. "You do not have that kind of capital. You are just a consultant. You crunch numbers for local firms. You begged us to stay in that apartment." I took a slow, measured step forward. My stiletto clicked against the polished stone, ringing out like a judge striking a gavel. "I never begged you for anything, Thomas. I allowed you to believe a carefully constructed narrative because I knew that if you realized the actual magnitude of my wealth, your financial parasitism would have escalated from a $5,000 monthly allowance to demanding millions. I am not a mid-level consultant. I am a founding partner of Apex Horizon Ventures. I control an investment portfolio worth over $800 million. I sit on the board of directors for 3 major technology firms in the Pacific Northwest. I am the apex predator in the exact financial ecosystem your fraudulent son-in-law was desperately trying to infiltrate. Barbara shook her head violently, her perfectly styled hair falling into her panicked eyes. "No, that is impossible. You would have told us. We are your family. You would have shared your success with us." I laughed, a sharp, humorless sound that echoed harshly off the vaulted ceiling. "Shared my success? You mean you would have demanded I fund your absurd, fake wealthy lifestyle on a much grander scale? You would have expected me to buy you yachts and vacation homes while you continued to parade Amanda around as the superior golden daughter. You spent my entire life belittling my ambitions, calling my career choices safe and unremarkable. You mocked my independence, so I let you live in the dark. I built my empire in total secrecy, protecting my assets from your relentless toxic greed. I turned my attention back to the pathetic figure kneeling on the floor. Terrence slowly looked up at me, his eyes red and wide with terror. His designer turtleneck suddenly looked ridiculous, a cheap costume on a man who had just been financially eviscerated. "When your pitch deck landed on my desk 3 weeks ago," I addressed him directly. My voice echoing with ruthless corporate finality, "I actually thought it was a joke. You asked my firm for $10 million based on a slide deck filled with stolen stock photos and meaningless industry buzzwords. You claimed you had a proprietary algorithm. My lead software engineer reviewed your code in exactly 12 minutes. It was completely hollow. You patched together open-source templates, slapped a sleek user interface on top of it, and called it a revolutionary machine learning platform. You had absolutely no product, zero revenue streams, and a user base consisting entirely of fake accounts you purchased from click farms overseas." Amanda sobbed louder, sliding down the wall until she hit the floor next to her husband. "Terrence, tell her she is wrong," Amanda wailed, pounding her fist against his shoulder. "Tell her you have a real company. You promised we were moving to Medina." "He cannot tell you that, Amanda," I snapped, silencing her instantly. "Because he knows I hold the audit reports." Terrence was running a classic shell game. He took out massive high-interest loans from secondary lenders to rent luxury office space he never actually used. He leased sports cars to look successful for his Instagram followers. He paid for highly produced marketing videos inside the luxury apartment he thought he was stealing from me. He was burning through borrowed cash to maintain an illusion, hoping he could con a legitimate venture capital firm into bailing him out before his creditors came to collect. He thought he could fake it until he made it, but he forgot that the people writing the checks are infinitely smarter than he is. Terrence swallowed hard, his hands shaking violently. "You could have just declined the pitch," he whispered, his voice cracking with pure despair. "You could have just sent a standard rejection email. Why did you do this to me?" "Because you made it personal," I replied, stepping right up to him. "You sat in that mediation room and insulted my life. You called me a miserable, lonely woman. You bragged that you would step over my starving body once you had my firm's money in your bank account. You cheered when my parents handed me an eviction notice on my birthday. You wanted to play ruthless corporate titan Terrence. Welcome to the major leagues. I paced slowly around the foyer, addressing the entire room of stunned guests and horrified relatives. Venture capital is not a charity, I explained, projecting my voice with absolute authority. When my analysts uncovered the catastrophic depth of his financial liabilities, I saw an opportunity. My firm possesses a highly specialized division dedicated to acquiring distressed debt. Terrence was in default on 3 separate predatory loans. His creditors were preparing to send collection agencies after him. I stepped in and purchased that bad debt for pennies on the dollar. I looked back down at my brother-in-law. I did not just reject your funding application, Terrence. I became your sole creditor. I own every single debt you possess. And because you were arrogant enough to sign personal guarantees on those loans, believing your fake $10 million funding round would easily cover them, I legally seized your personal assets. As we speak, my asset recovery team is locking down your bank accounts. They are seizing your leased servers. They are liquidating the cheap, flashy office furniture you rented. Your car lease is being terminated. You are not going to be a tech billionaire. You are officially entirely bankrupt. The reality of his absolute ruin finally settled over the room. The extended family members, the aunts and uncles who had eagerly attended this dinner to celebrate my downfall, were staring at me in sheer terror. They were witnessing a financial slaughter executed with terrifying precision. They realized that the quiet, scapegoated daughter they had all ignored was actually a corporate executioner, capable of dismantling a human life with a few strokes of a pen. But I was not finished. The destruction of Terrence was merely the opening act. The true target of my wrath was still standing by the dining room entrance. I turned my gaze away from the sobbing tech bro and locked eyes directly with Thomas and Barbara. Their faces were ashen, stripped of every ounce of their arrogant superiority. They thought the nightmare was over. They thought I had solely come to punish Amanda and her husband. They had absolutely no idea that the financial guillotine I had built was large enough for all of them. I reached into my designer leather tote and pulled out a second, significantly thicker manila envelope. It was time to show my parents what happens when you treat a venture capitalist like a disposable automated teller machine. I held the thick manila envelope high enough for the entire room to see. The heavy paper brushed against my fingertips, containing the absolute destruction of my parents' carefully curated suburban royalty narrative. Thomas stared at the envelope, the remaining color draining from his face until he looked practically translucent. Barbara gripped the edge of the dining table, her knuckles turning stark white as her perfectly manicured fingernails dug into the expensive linen cloth. For years I began my voice projecting across the grand foyer with icy precision. You both paraded around this neighborhood, acting like titans of industry. You hosted lavish charity dinners. You leased matching luxury vehicles. You turned up your noses at anyone who did not meet your ridiculous standards of wealth. You made sure every single relative and neighbor in this room believed you owned this sprawling estate free and clear. I took a slow, deliberate step toward them. The crowd of onlookers instinctively parted, creating a wide circle around my parents. The sheer panic in my father's eyes was magnificent. But real wealth is quiet, Thomas, I stated, locking my gaze with his. Fake wealth is loud, and fake wealth leaves a very messy, very desperate paper trail. When I officially severed your $5,000 monthly allowance, I did not just cut off your grocery budget. I knew exactly what that money was actually funding. I just needed to confirm the exact depth of your financial depravity. Thomas swallowed hard. His throat bobbed up and down. Lauren, he pleaded, his voice dropping into a frantic, hushed whisper. Do not do this. Not in front of our friends. We can go into the study. We can talk about this privately. I smiled, shaking my head. You did not want privacy when you handed me an eviction notice on my birthday in the middle of a crowded 5-star steakhouse. You did not want privacy when you dragged me to a legal mediation to extort me for $100,000. We are going to do this right here in front of every single person you have been lying to for the past decade. I unfastened the clasp on the envelope and pulled out a stack of banking documents bearing the bold, unmistakable logo of a major national bank. You see, I announced to the silent captive audience, my parents are not the financial geniuses they pretend to be. A few years ago, when Amanda demanded a six-figure wedding and Terrence needed seed money to pretend he was a tech entrepreneur, Thomas and Barbara realized their credit cards were completely maxed out. They had zero liquid cash, so they committed the ultimate sin of fake wealth. They took out a massive home equity line of credit against this very mansion. Barbara let out a sharp, pathetic gasp, covering her mouth with both hands. The guests behind her began to murmur the scandalous revelation rippling through the wealthy suburbanites like a shockwave. To this crowd, leveraging a primary residence to fund a lifestyle was the ultimate social taboo. You mortgaged your entire future, I continued, relentlessly holding up the first page of the bank records. You took out a variable rate loan for hundreds of thousands of dollars. You used your home as an ATM to fund Amanda's designer maternity dresses, her luxury vacations to Europe, and to secretly float Terrence's failing business because you were terrified your golden child would look poor. You dug a massive financial grave, and the only reason the bank approved that insane line of credit was because they saw a consistent, verified $5,000 cash injection hitting your checking account every single month for 7 years. I stepped closer until I was just inches away from my father. My money was the only thing keeping your entire illusion afloat. You used my generosity to subsidize your golden child. You treated me like a disposable asset, completely forgetting that the asset was the only thing standing between you and absolute ruin. Amanda, still huddled on the floor next to her broken husband, looked up at our parents in sheer horror. "Mom," she whimpered, her voice trembling. "Is that true? Did you mortgage the house for us?" Barbara could not even look at her favorite daughter. She stared at the floor, hot tears finally spilling over her heavily powdered cheeks, ruining her expensive makeup. She was humiliated. The wealthy friends she had invited to show off her success were now staring at her with undisguised pity and disgust. When I canceled my automatic transfer last month, the dominoes fell exactly as I predicted. I declared, my voice echoing with absolute authority. You had grown completely dependent on my cash to make the minimum payments on your exorbitant home equity line of credit. Without my $5,000, you could not cover the interest. Your account went into immediate arrears. You missed the massive payment deadline. You panicked. You tried to extort me with a cheap lawyer, hoping you could bully me into paying the ransom before the bank took action. Thomas glared at me, a desperate feral anger replacing his shock. You planned this. He spat, his hands balling into fists at his sides. You knew the payment was due. You purposely tried to destroy us. I did not force you to take out a toxic loan to fund a fake billionaire lifestyle. I fired back, my tone sharp and unyielding. You built a house of cards on a foundation of greed, Thomas. I simply removed my card from the bottom of the deck. I am not responsible for gravity. I flipped to the final document in the stack. The paper was printed on thick, formal legal stock and bore the terrifying red stamp of the county clerk's office. When a high-risk loan of this magnitude goes into default, I explained to the captivated room, banks move aggressively. They do not wait around for you to figure out your finances. They instantly categorize the loan as distressed debt. They flag the property for immediate action to recover their capital. I held the document up, turning it so my father could see the stark, bold lettering at the top of the page. It was a formal notice of default and intent to foreclose. Your bank initiated the foreclosure process 3 days ago, I revealed, watching the final shred of hope permanently vacate my father's eyes. They flagged this exact mansion for seizure. You have officially lost the estate, Thomas. You have absolutely no money, no credit, and no legal standing to fight the bank. The magnitude of the devastation was absolute. In less than 20 minutes, I had bankrupted my arrogant brother-in-law and publicly exposed my parents as completely destitute frauds. But the true masterpiece of my retaliation was still locked away in my briefcase. Exposing their foreclosure was only the setup. I had not just come here to tell them they were losing their home. I had come here to tell them exactly who was taking it from them. I stepped past the remaining guests, moving deliberately toward the center of the extravagant Thanksgiving table. The roasted turkey, the imported centerpieces, and the crystal goblets all looked like props in a tragic play. Thomas and Barbara followed my movement with wide, panicked eyes. They were already completely broken by the public revelation of their bankruptcy, but they were still clinging to the desperate, naive hope that they could somehow negotiate with a faceless national bank. They thought they could beg for an extension. They thought they could file for bankruptcy protection and drag the foreclosure process out for years. They were incredibly mistaken. I reached into the leather portfolio that Hayes had handed me earlier. The high-grade corporate paper felt heavy and substantial in my grip. I pulled out the final stack of documents. These pages bore the official embossed seals of the county clerk and the unmistakable signature of a superior court judge. The sheer weight of the legal authority in my hands was intoxicating. When a major national bank classifies a luxury residential loan as a total toxic loss, I explained, pitching my voice so every single eavesdropping neighbor and relative could hear the brutal mechanics of their ruin. They do not want to deal with the messy, protracted legal battle of a drawn-out foreclosure procedure. They want to instantly scrub the liability from their quarterly balance sheets. So they bundle that bad debt and they sell it off at a steep discount to private holding companies and specialized investment firms. They sell it to firms that possess the ruthless legal infrastructure required to execute immediate aggressive asset seizures. Thomas took a shaky step back. His chest heaved as he struggled to draw breath. Barbara swayed on her feet, leaning heavily against a velvet dining chair to keep from collapsing onto the imported Persian rug. Amanda and Terrence were still frozen on the floor, watching the absolute destruction of their financial safety net in real time. You see, my venture capital firm does not just fund technology startups. I continued, my tone entirely conversational, yet completely lethal. Our distressed asset division is incredibly aggressive. We monitor premium real estate defaults very closely. When the automated algorithm flagged a massive catastrophic default on a high-equity suburban estate linked to the exact same individuals who were currently attempting to extort one of our senior partners, my acquisitions team moved with unprecedented speed. We do not let prime real estate slip through our fingers. I walked right up to the head of the dining table. I slammed the thick stack of foreclosure paperwork down onto the pristine white linen. I pushed the documents forward with the flat of my hand. The heavy packet slid smoothly across the table, knocking over a crystal water goblet. The ice water spilled across the fabric, soaking into the expensive cloth and pooling around the roasted turkey. But no one moved a single muscle to clean it up. The entire room was paralyzed by the tension. Thomas stared down at the documents as if they were a live explosive device. Read the name of the holding company listed as the sole proprietor of the debt I commanded. My voice left absolutely zero room for argument or hesitation. Read it out loud, Thomas. Read exactly who owns your home. His trembling hands reached out and hovered over the paperwork. He hesitated, terrified of confirming his own demise. He slowly dragged his eyes down the page until he found the bold, capitalized print of the purchasing entity. His lips parted, but his vocal cords completely failed him. He let out a strangled, pathetic wheeze, unable to vocalize the reality of his failure. Barbara snatched the paper from the wet table. She read the heading and her eyes rolled back slightly. The thick paper slipped from her fingers, fluttering to the floor like a dead leaf. She gasped for air, clutching her pearl necklace. Since my parents seemed to have lost their ability to speak, I announced to the silent, terrified room, "I will gladly clarify the situation for everyone present. Yesterday morning, my firm wired the exact payoff amount to your original lender. We purchased your defaulted home equity line of credit in its absolute entirety. We fast-tracked the deed transfer through our priority legal channels. The bank no longer owns this mansion. They sold your bad debt to me." The gasp that ripped through the crowd of onlookers was visceral. Relatives who had spent years kissing up to my parents suddenly looked at me with a mixture of profound terror and deep newfound respect. The social hierarchy of the entire family had just been violently inverted. "I am the bank now," I stated, stepping directly into my father's personal space, forcing him to look me right in the eyes. I hold the paper. I hold the deed. I own the walls, the floorboards, and the roof over your head. You are nothing more than a delinquent tenant living in my property. You have zero equity and zero rights. Thomas opened his mouth, hot tears of pure desperation finally spilling over his eyelids and tracking down his flushed cheeks. "Lauren, please," he begged, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, humiliating whine. "This is our home. This is where you grew up. You cannot take our home from us. Where will we go? We have absolutely nothing left. Amanda is going to have a baby." I looked at him, my expression completely devoid of pity. I looked at Barbara, who was openly sobbing into her hands, ruining her expensive holiday makeup. I looked at Amanda and Terrence, the golden child, and her fraudulent husband, who had gleefully cheered when I was thrown out into the cold Seattle rain just a few weeks prior. They had expected me to fund their lives forever. "You are evicting your own parents," Barbara cried out, her voice echoing shrilly against the vaulted ceilings. "How can you be so heartless?" I leaned in close, ensuring my words would burn themselves permanently into their memories. I used the exact precise cadence my mother had used on my 33rd birthday. "I am giving you a notice to vacate," I corrected her coldly. "I want you to remember exactly how you treated me when you handed me that envelope at the steakhouse. You told me I had until midnight. You told me if I tried to stay, you would call the police and have me arrested for trespassing. You showed me absolutely no mercy. You laughed while I walked out the door and abandoned me." I tapped my manicured fingernail against the wet table, my gaze sweeping over the ruined Thanksgiving feast. "So I am returning the exact same level of generosity," I declared, my voice ringing with absolute final authority. "You have until midnight tomorrow to vacate my property. You will leave the keys on the kitchen counter. You will leave all the appliances and fixtures exactly where they are. If you are still inside this house at 12:01, my private security team will physically remove you for criminal trespassing." I turned my back on their weeping, pathetic figures and began walking toward the grand front doors. The crowd parted for me, instantly dropping their gaze as I passed. I paused just before crossing the threshold and looked over my shoulder one last time, staring at the shattered remains of my toxic family. Out by midnight, I repeated, delivering the final fatal blow. "We are done." The moment the heavy mahogany doors clicked shut behind me, the true chaos erupted inside the mansion. I did not even make it halfway down the stone pathway to my car before the front doors flew open violently. Thomas and Barbara stumbled out into the freezing November night, completely abandoning their stunned, wealthy guests in the foyer. They practically tripped over themselves running down the walkway. "Lauren, wait!" Thomas screamed, his voice cracking with unfiltered primal panic. He threw himself onto the wet pavement right in front of my vehicle, scraping his expensive dress pants against the concrete. Barbara fell to her knees right beside him, completely disregarding the mud soaking into her designer silk dress. She grabbed the hem of my charcoal suit jacket, her hands shaking violently. "You cannot do this to your own flesh and blood," Barbara wailed, her mascara running in dark streaks down her face, entirely destroying her carefully crafted aristocratic image. "Blood is thicker than water, Lauren. We are your parents. You have to forgive us. We will do anything you want. Just please do not take our home." From the porch, Amanda was screaming hysterically, holding her maternity dress, begging her husband to fix the situation. But Terrence was nowhere to be seen. The realization hit me immediately. Terrence had not chased after me to beg for his company back. The coward had bolted out the back door the second he realized my asset recovery team was currently seizing his leased sports car and freezing his personal accounts. He was already running from his creditors, leaving his pregnant wife behind to deal with the absolute ruin he had helped orchestrate. I looked down at the two pathetic figures kneeling in the freezing rain. I gently but firmly pulled my suit jacket out of my mother's desperate grip. "Blood is thicker than water," I stated, my voice echoing coldly in the quiet suburban street. That is the exact excuse toxic people use to justify their endless abuse. You did not care about my blood when you handed me an eviction notice on my birthday. You did not care about family when you demanded I pay for your fake luxury lifestyle. You treated me like an automated teller machine for 7 years. Well, the machine is out of funds and the bank is permanently closed. I stepped into my car, locked the doors, and drove away, leaving them kneeling in the driveway as their fake empire collapsed around them. Fast forward 6 months. The spectacular downfall of my family was a harsh, unrelenting lesson in financial gravity. Without my $5,000 monthly subsidy, and with their massive estate legally seized and liquidated by my venture capital firm, Thomas and Barbara, were forced to face the brutal reality of their actual net worth. They now live in a cramped, outdated two-bedroom rental on the far outskirts of the city. The rent is cheap, the walls are paper-thin, and they are drowning under a mountain of unsecured credit card debt they can never hope to repay. The luxury cars were repossessed months ago, forcing Thomas to take the public bus to a low-paying retail job just to keep the lights on. Their country club friends blocked their numbers the second the foreclosure went public, treating them like a contagious disease. Terrence completely vanished. When the bankruptcy court finalized the liquidation of his fraudulent tech startup, he fled the state to avoid further civil litigation, abandoning Amanda entirely. My sister, the former golden child who used to endlessly mock my independence, was forced to move into the tiny second bedroom of our parents' cheap rental. She recently gave birth and now relies entirely on state assistance to afford basic necessities. She constantly complains on social media about how unfair her life has become, but her comment sections are completely empty. The grand illusion is over. Meanwhile, my life has never been more peaceful. I am standing right now in my high-rise corner office, looking out over the Seattle skyline as the morning sun breaks through the clouds. My venture capital firm just closed our most profitable quarter in company history. The stress, the constant anxiety, and the suffocating weight of my family's endless financial and emotional demands are completely gone. I finally have the space to breathe and enjoy the wealth I worked so hard to build. As for the downtown apartment that started this entire cascade of karma, I never moved back in. Instead, I legally transferred the deed to a highly respected local charity that provides emergency fully furnished transitional housing for women escaping domestic and financial abuse. The organization beautifully renovated the space using a massive grant my firm provided, turning it into a gorgeous, comfortable sanctuary. Knowing that the property is now a safe haven for women rebuilding their lives, rather than a monument to my parents' greed and entitlement, brings me an incredible amount of joy. It was the absolute best way to cleanse the space of their toxic energy. Family is supposed to be your safe harbor, not the storm you have to constantly rebuild your life after. Blood does not give anyone the right to exploit your generosity or demand your hard-earned resources. Family is not just biology. It is about mutual respect, support, and genuine care. If you have people in your life who only contact you when they need money, who belittle your achievements, and who treat your boundaries as a personal insult, you owe it to yourself to cut the cord entirely. You do not have to set yourself on fire just to keep toxic people warm. Step back, protect your peace, and let them face the natural consequences of their own actions. Have you ever had to walk away from toxic family members to protect your mental health and your finances? Share your story in the comments below. If this journey resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories about setting firm boundaries and reclaiming your personal power. Thank you for watching, and remember, your true worth is never determined by how much you can be exploited. The story of Lauren and her manipulative family serves as a powerful testament to one of life's most difficult but necessary lessons. True self-worth can never be purchased, and establishing ironclad boundaries is the only way to survive a toxic environment. For years, Lauren operated under the quiet hope that by funding her parents' extravagant lifestyle and providing them with a luxury home, she might eventually earn the respect she was so brutally denied. Instead, her generosity was weaponized against her. Her family viewed her not as a daughter, but as a disposable asset, an automated teller machine meant to fund their illusions of grandeur while they continuously elevated her sister. The profound lesson here is that transactional love is a bottomless pit. You cannot love finance or reason a toxic person into respecting you. When Lauren's family handed her an eviction notice on her birthday, they operated under the arrogant assumption that she was too emotionally dependent to fight back. However, by severing the financial cord and stripping away her assets, Lauren reclaimed her power. She demonstrated that walking away from abusive blood relatives is not an act of cruelty. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation. Her journey teaches us that we absolutely do not have to set ourselves on fire just to keep our abusers warm. The moment she stopped seeking their validation was the exact moment she became truly untouchable, allowing their own greed to orchestrate their downfall. We must learn to recognize when our generosity is being exploited and find the courage to walk away from tables where respect is no longer being served. If you are currently pouring your energy into people who only value what you can provide, take a step back today and start investing that worth back into yourself.